Hey, we're back. Spatial Shark here with you for Unit 3. This is Cultural Patterns and Processes. So, what are we going to talk about as we get into Unit 3? So, human geography and cultural geography are almost kind of like, cousins, right? There's a lot of cultural geography throughout our course. And so far in Unit 1, we kind of hit the foundations and the basics. We talked a lot about the different skills and topics we're going to cover. Unit 2, of course, was all about population and migration patterns and processes. And now here we are in Unit 3, going to focus solely on culture. So we're going to talk about language, religion, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all kinds of cool things about cultural geography. And remember, culture affects every human decision, every human action. It's such a simple thing, but it's really also at the same time incredibly hard to understand because, what do we even say culture is? Most people will tell you that there's a simple 3-word definition. Culture is your way of life. But culture is also about your identity. It's who are you? It's not only who do you see yourself as, but who do others see you as, right? Because we obviously have these identities that we carry with us. We're going to talk a little bit about the cultural landscape. That's actually going to be topic 3.2, where we talk about the built environment. What do we see? There's a way that you can read the cultural landscape if you're really observant and you're open to this spatial perspective, right? As you walk down a street, you should be able to kind of read the signs and get a feel for this area, right? And that's what they mean by the cultural landscape, right? You see it through the lens of geography. And of course, we can see people's identity as well. The clothes that they're wearing, the food that they're eating, the music that they're listening to, the way they dance, the sports that they play. But don't forget, it's like an iceberg. And I love this imagery here where we see certain things. And I mentioned, food and dress and music and, dancing and those kinds of things. You see that above the waterline of the iceberg, but look at everything down below. Right? Just people's, sensation of right and wrong, courtship practices, motivations, what do they feel like is beautiful? What's the nature of friendship? What do these facial expressions mean that only somebody from their culture would know? Right? How do they use their eyes to communicate or speak with their hands? Right? Look at what they think about in terms of what's right and wrong, what's justice, what's their moral compass of their culture, of their group of people, of their family. Right? You don't always see those things because those things can be below the surface of the water, so to speak. Right? But all of these things are part of what makes our culture, part of what makes our identity. So we have to analyze then what the cultural hierarchy really is all about. So I put these kind of in order, and you'll see that cultural traits are single specific attributes, right? These are things that we do as habits. They're the things that we've been taught, the things that we've picked up from our parents, from our norms and behavior, right? From our friends, right? And certainly today, students are much more impacted by social media than even, they are by their parents anymore. It's not like when Spatial Shark was a kid back in the 70s, where parents still had a lot more influence, right? But then you move from that individual trait, those things that make you unique, and then you get to kind of a cultural complex. And you have some discrete combinations of traits. Some things are the same, some things are a little bit different. This might be like you with your siblings and your parents, a nuclear family. More often than not, you're going to share a cultural complex. You won't share all of the same traits. One sibling might like the arts and the other one might like athletics. One might be really good at math. The other one might be really good at writing. They're still siblings. They still share most things in common. They might like Taco Tuesday, right? But they're going to be different in certain specific ways. Then you get to kind of like this cultural system where you might see like the whole school, we want you to be a shark, right? Be honest, be attentive, be responsible, be kind. We want everybody in the cultural system to buy into that, right? All people who have the same identity of race or ethnicity might fit into a cultural system. All people of a similar faith group, all people who speak a similar language, right? That might be where you see some similarities. But if you look at each individual person, they're still going to have different traits. Then you go to a cultural region, much bigger, and that might be where a cultural system prevails. And that might be something like a country. It could be something like a region of the world, like a Latin America. Again, if you go below, change the scale of analysis, you go below that cultural region and you get a little more localized, you're going to find that there's differences, right? People in the Caribbean play baseball more, and people in South America play soccer more. They're still Latin American, right? And so when you see cultural realms, these are the biggest groupings of all. And this might be like what we say African or Asian. These are huge areas of land, right? That within them, there will be different cultural regions. East Asia different than, say, Southwest Asia. South Asia being different than Southeast Asia, right? Sub-Saharan Africa being different from North Africa, right? And so this is where we start to see that this is a hierarchy, right? It's like a ladder, right? You go from the individual to the group. You change your scale of analysis as you go. So let's take a look at this then kind of on a map. And you can see what I mean by these really big, kind of cultural realm spaces like Western culture that would include not only Europe, but also Anglo-North America, right? Canada, the United States, the English-speaking parts, as well as Australia. And again, Latin America, this massive, massive cultural region that loosely has some commonalities, right? Obviously speaking Spanish, obviously majority Roman Catholic. Notice that Brazil gets lumped in there as Latin American, even though we wouldn't necessarily define them as being Hispanic because they're not Spanish based by culture, right? We can see the Islamic world, right? The area where Muslims are predominant. We see the Sinic. And by the way, you also need to remember that that's anything Chinese. If it's Sino, S-I-N-O, it's always going to be referring to China. So that's a big East Asian cultural region. Obviously, in India, there's a predominantly Hindu majority, but don't forget, there's big minority populations there too. That's why you've got some of that striation of the stripes there, right? We have an Orthodox Russian, Eastern Orthodox kind of region of the world there. The Buddhist world, Southeast Asia primarily. And then, of course, Japanese, kind of interesting because it's kind of out there by itself. Right? Being on an island sometimes can do that because there's an isolation factor that goes along with that. Right? If we zoom in, change our scale of analysis, now instead of looking at a global map, we've zoomed into just one particular region of the world, and notice that we can then also break down into smaller chunks some of these smaller cultural regions. And what they've chosen to do with this one is how did they obtain their food? Were they herders of cattle? Were they farmers? Were they, different groups obtained their food in different ways. Their housing might be different. Their clothing might be different. Their language might be different, right? But all of these cultural regions in sub-Saharan Africa, generally speaking, were subsistence agricultural practicers, right? They were nomadic herders, or they were farmers that were, subsistence or sedentary agricultural producers. So what does this mean in terms of how we identify where cultures come from? Right? There's a word that I always think of, my heart, when I think of this. The heart is kind of like the source of all the blood that's pumping through your body. So the cultural heart is the source area of a cultural identity. Every single culture in the world has a hearth that it's come from. Not every hearth is going to produce a massive civilization, but every civilization starts out in a cultural hearth. Right now, from your study of most world history classes that the cultural hearths really started often in river valleys, right? River valleys were where there was enough water to provide for, massive amounts of food. Remember, more food always means more people. And therefore, wherever there was big, strong, water supplies, you had a lot of agriculture. This is where all of our early civilizations are going to develop. Right? So these cultural hearths are going to be the places where we produce the ideas, the innovations, the technological advancements, right? That are going to be these big things that define what makes a civilization, whether it's a system of writing like hieroglyphics, whether it's inventing the wheel, whether it's, developing new technologies like gunpowder in China. All of these things are going to be identifiable based on these cultural hearths. So just to kind of show you on a map what that might look like, we can see that East Asia has a definite cultural hearth area along the Yangtze, right? The Yangtze River Valley. In India, the Ganges Plain is a big agricultural area and the source of a major civilization. The Indus River Valley, cutting through what is today modern day Pakistan. The Harappans are the people in world history you might learn about there. You've got obviously Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the Nile, where we took kids a couple of years ago on a spring break trip. And that's, of course, our Egyptians, famous for the pyramids and many other advancements. You've got a West African hearth area. This is famous for the place called Timbuktu. There's also a beautiful mud mosque in Janneh, Mali. And you can kind of go look some of these things up, especially as you get into 10th grade and you start studying world history, right? You've got Andean America, where the Inca were predominant. And of course, Machu Picchu is very famous. We took kids there a few years ago as well. Mesoamerica, famous for both the Maya and for the Aztec, who would come after that. And then notice that they've got a more modern hearth area. Europe certainly is a big civilization that we study, the Greeks and the Romans, all that. Don't forget, that's, the ancient world is ancient to even the Greeks. When we went to Egypt, we were inside some of the Egyptian, amazing architectural places, and you would see graffiti that was from the Greek people who had gone to Egypt 2,000 years after the Egyptians had built all that stuff. And you're like, man, we think the Greeks are old. The Greeks visited this place and they thought, man, this stuff is old, right? So it's incredible when you see some of these modern cultural hearths. Certainly Eastern North America is a modern cultural hearth today. The inventions that come out of the United States because of the Industrial Revolution, all of the technologies and all of the big things that are happening. Even Western North America, don't forget Apple and Google and Microsoft and all of these big companies that are today really impacting culture, even in ways like the new TikToks of the world. These are things that are going to be in these cultural hearths, okay? So how does culture then spread? When we get into this unit a lot, you're going to see that, topic 3.4 is about diffusion. Topic 3.5 is historical diffusion. Topic 3.6 is contemporary diffusion. So, first of all, we kind of need to know what diffusion means. Diffusion is, of course, any time that an innovation or an idea, any kind of a cultural trait is going to spread from its source to other places, right? So this is what we refer to as cultural diffusion. Right. Obviously, as geographers, we can map these things. We can draw flow lines like you saw on the previous map. We can tell you that Islam started on the Arabian Peninsula. We can say that Buddhism originated in northern India. We can say that, the printing press started in Germany. We can say that, steel manufacturing, an early place of that was in Great Britain. There's lots of ways that we can identify these hearts of these different innovations and these ideas. Right? But just because you have two groups of people that built pyramids doesn't mean that they had interaction with each other. For example, you can find pyramids in the Western Hemisphere if you go to places like Tikal in Central America or Tulum, and you go see the Mayan pyramids that they built, they're step-sided pyramids. But you can find the same kind of step-sided pyramids in Egypt. That doesn't mean that the Maya and the Egyptians were kind of like, texting each other and sharing their blueprints for their architectural plans, faxing each other and things like that. It's not like that they were sharing a Google Doc. That just didn't happen. Of course, today we have a lot more interactivity because of our accessibility and connectivity in terms of technology, communication, and travel and things like that. But we call this independent invention when we've got two cultures that kind of come up with the same idea in a similar way, but they didn't necessarily share those ideas with each other. Even sometimes today, companies can sometimes still do this. You look at, for example, Samsung and Apple and their phone products and how similar and how overlapping sometimes some of those things are, right? It's not always because they're sharing, because they're competitors. And it's not that they stole each other's technology and ideas. It's that sometimes people come up with similar ideas and are implementing them in similar ways. Of course, that there can also be barriers to diffusion, right? Now, used to be, space was a big barrier. Not so much anymore. Barriers today might be things like, society, right? Society might, your religion might put a barrier on diffusion. Your cultural group might say, "Ooh, that's taboo. That's something we don't want," right? Your parents can sometimes be a barrier to cultural diffusion, right? Your friends might be a barrier to cultural diffusion, right? Oh, why are you going to go play that sport? Play this sport instead. We see barriers to diffusion can be things like money. We see barriers to diffusion can be things like lack of education and lack of opportunity, right? So there's all kinds of ways that diffusion can either happen and be promoted and encouraged and accelerated, or sometimes it can be delayed, or it can even be inhibited or even prevented altogether. So what kinds of diffusion are we going to experience then? And this is pretty much straight up vocab. If you've read my friend David Palmer's Blue Book in Unit 3, you're going to see that he lays this out beautifully for you. All right, two big categories of diffusion: expansion diffusion, relocation diffusion. All right, we'll tackle these kind of one at a time. Expansion diffusion. I always tell kids it's kind of like blowing up a balloon, right? It's expanding, it's growing, it's going to be more quantity, right? Because of it. Generally speaking, it's also going to stay strong in its source area, right? The big thing to remember about expansion is an increase in quantity, right? So if we're talking about the spread of a religion, the spread of a language, the numbers of speakers, there's going to be more speakers, right? Because of expansion. It's going to be like McDonald's. It's going to be like Walmart. It's going to be like Amazon, right? It's going to be an expansion, right? So the first kind of this is something we already kind of know a little bit about. That's contagious diffusion, kind of like a coronavirus, but kind of like any kind of a disease like that that's infectious or contagious. The number of cases goes up. Well, the same thing happens with contagious diffusion, right? This is like, remember a couple of years ago when we were all doing that ice bucket challenge and we were calling each other out and everybody was online and they were dumping ice cold water on their heads, right? To draw attention, right? To ALS, right? So when we think about that, that's a contagious diffusion. More and more and more and more and more people were taking on that trait, okay? So if it's hierarchical, it's a little bit different. It skips over certain people because of access and connectivity. So in a hierarchical diffusion, it's going to be point to point and it's going to be specific, or it's going to go what they call larger to smaller. If the superintendent of Palm Beach County Schools, right, makes a decision and he tells all of the area superintendents and they tell all the principals and the principals tell all the teachers, the department chairs like me, and then all the teachers are told, and then all of the students are told and the parents are told. It's a hierarchical system because it's coming down, like we said, with the cultural traits and the system and all that. It's coming down a ladder. It's coming down steps, okay? Now, there can also be what we call reverse hierarchical, where it starts at the bottom and it works its way back up again. And this might be like a student comes up with a great idea, right? Or student government approaches Principal Castellano and says, "Hey, we think we should do this for school spirit." And then it grows and it catches on and it goes to other schools, right? But it may not go to every school, right? So hierarchical skips over. Some people miss out, right? But hierarchical is going to follow that pattern, right? So when we say we drop a rock into a pond, it just goes out in every single direction, right? And that's contagious. But if you skip that rock across the pond, it hops. And everywhere it makes contact with the water, you see the ripples, but then the ripples sometimes skip over 3, 4, 5 feet, right? That's representative of what we mean by this different kind of diffusion. The third kind of expansion is what we call stimulus. And this is, like any stimulus, it causes a response. Well, in this case, the trait is adopted, but it's also adapted. It's somehow changed, right? This is like, again, Mac versus PC. Essentially, they do the same thing, but they have different types of operating systems, right? Different user interfaces. Of course, Mac, came up with this beautiful idea for being able to run multiple tabs at the same time. And a certain young nerdy guy named Bill Gates said, "Wouldn't that be cool if we did that for PC? We made all these cool things called Windows," right? And that's where Microsoft Windows actually came from, right? So when you think about this, this is like McDonald's moving into India. Well, bit of a problem. Hindus are not going to eat beef. Cows are sacred. So what does McDonald's do? They change slightly their food offerings so that it's acceptable to the Indian diet, right? And you'll end up with a Maharaja Mac, right? You'll get these veggie burgers. You'll get, these other types of foods that are not going to be offensive, that are not going to run afoul of the taboos, of the restrictions of language or religion or race or ethnicity or whatever the case may be. Okay. And this happens quite a lot with companies that do business in other parts of the world. They have to adjust, right? They have to have a stimulus diffusion. It's still going to increase, right? McDonald's is still going to open a lot more locations, but they're going to do slightly different things with their food products. And McDonald's is great at that all over the world. They've done it in Japan. They've done it in China. They've done it in India. They've done it in the Middle East. When we were in Egypt, the kids were like, they loved this thing called the McArabia, right? And it was like a pita with chicken inside, right? So when you think about the different places in the world that they operate, right, they're always thinking about that stimulus diffusion. So two little images here. The top one is contagious. You can see it's going in every direction. And the bottom one is hierarchical. You can see that it's skipping over some places and it's going kind of point to point to point to point. Okay. For example, you think about Starbucks. Starbucks didn't start off as contagious. It started off hierarchical. It was only in big urban areas. It wasn't everywhere in the United States, right? Walmart, on the other hand, was kind of reverse hierarchical. The first Walmart started in the 70s in a little teeny tiny town in Arkansas. Today, it's the biggest retail company in the world, right? So when you think about reverse hierarchical expansion, stimulus, the thing is, it's always going to be an expansion. Think about like blowing up a balloon. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Here's an example in corporate world where you've got, again, the president, the CEO, and they disseminate these decisions and policies out to the regional, the VPs, and then the regional managers, and then down to the sales staff and the people that work in every office in every city across the country, right? But again, comes from that hierarchical system down the flow chart. Basically, you take that same flow chart and you just put it into a map, right? And you say, oh, okay, the bigger cities are going to be more connected. The smaller cities where the smaller offices are, they're going to be lower on that hierarchy. It's basically just showing you in a spatial sense what that pattern would look like. So relocation diffusion, this is the other kind of diffusion that we were talking about. Whereas expansion diffusion is getting bigger, relocation diffusion is unique, right? What's going to happen here? The only way that relocation is going to move is if people move and they bring the idea with them. This is why sometimes migrant diffusion is the AKA for relocation diffusion, right? So they're going to take their religion with them. They're going to take their language with them. They're going to take their food with them. They're going to take their music, their sports, whatever it is. They're going to take it with them. There's no increase in the number of people practicing that trait. It's just that, if I've got a pen and I have this pen and I take it from here and I move it over there, there's still only one pen, right? It's just been relocated to a different place. If, on the other hand, they get to the new place and then other people say, hey, maybe we like this language, or maybe we like this food, or maybe we like this sport or holiday or whatever. And then suddenly you have two pens. Hey, now we've got expansion diffusion, right? Now we've got more than one. And now we can see that it changes. So you got to be careful when they ask you about which type of diffusion is it. If there's no increase, it's relocation. It can be relocation at the beginning, and then it can be expansion later. And remember, expansion can be three different ways. It could be contagious, it could be hierarchical, or it could be stimulus. Okay? So when we think about relocation diffusion, the idea or the innovation is carried along with the movement of the people, right? Now, whenever people move, right, inevitably, there's then going to be contact between these different, groups of people. So we say that there can be acculturation, where people kind of pick and choose, and they say, well, I'm going to take this, but I'm not going to take that. I'll start, I'll learn a little bit of their language, but I'm going to keep my own language too. And, I'll follow these traits, but not those traits. It's almost like cafeteria style, right? That's acculturation. You still retain a lot of your old identity. This happens a lot in the United States, where people will come to the United States and they'll start adopting some American traits, but they won't necessarily give up everything about the old country, right? Now, if they completely lose that old identity and they become so Americanized and so, one-sided, then we say that that's assimilation. And oftentimes that can be a little bit of pressure applied, right? This is what happened, for example, when the United States government forced Native Americans to live on a reservation and forced them to go to American schools and cut their hair and wear American clothes, right? That's that policy of assimilation, whereas acculturation is usually more by choice. If the two cultures blend almost equally or fairly, so to speak, then we say that that's transculturation, where you start to see more of a blended reality. Now, of course, time distance decay, we've already talked about that this year. We know that that is going to weaken the bonds, that the farther something goes or the more distance between them, the less interactivity that there can be. Now, we certainly know that because, as you know, our good friend Waldo Tobler said that everything's related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. Okay, so let's talk about cultural perception. This is not just reading the landscape. This is often, what we hear and what we see and what we smell and what we taste. And, we're using all of our five senses when we're talking about qualitative geospatial data. So when we walk down a street or when we're a tourist or, when we're in a new city for the first time, right? Or we go to a different part of the city that we're unfamiliar with, we start to read the landscape and we get a vibe, we get a feel. All right. Sometimes they'll call this a sense of place. Okay. And you have to be careful because you can't paint everybody with the same brush. And you have to be careful of the single story. Right. And we think of Africa. Oh, Africa. Remember Hans in the video was telling us that when you're in this wealthy world and you're looking down, you see everybody is equally poor. Well, the reality is, if you were living on that $1 a day level and you look up at the $10 a day people, wow. I mean, you add a zero to your family's income, it's going to change your life, right? So, they may look at us as all of us are greedy and wasteful. Oh, look at all these Americans, wasting energy and throwing away food and, all of the things that we do that are not super sustainable and earth friendly, right? So again, you have to be careful because in our class, we use a lot of generalizations, but we have to be careful of what we call stereotypes, right? So you think about the South in the United States, right? Is that a bunch of good old boys driving NASCAR? Is it a bunch of pickup trucks with Confederate flags in the back? The South today is not defined by that same identity as maybe it was, 60 years ago, right? You think about South Florida. The old joke is the further south in Florida you go, the more north you get, right? People generally think of Boca and they say, oh, that's the retirement area. That's where the old people are. I always joke when I go to the AP reading and people see my name tag that I work at Spanish River in Boca Raton. I say, they say, you got the old people in Boca. I said, no, we don't have any old people. We have the old people's parents, right? So when we think about these generalizations, we have to be careful that we don't go too far, right, into this, stereotypical kind of attitude. So when we think about defining the South, right, there's many different ways you could do this, right? We could say, oh, let's take just the states that were, Confederate states, the states that seceded, right? Not just even the slave states, because, Missouri and Kentucky and Delaware and Maryland were slave states, but they never seceded. So are they part of the South, right? What about if they're Baptist or not? The Southern Baptist, church, very evangelical church, right? Very, very American church, right? Started in the United States. Not everybody in the South is Baptist, okay? It rarely snows in the South, right? So is that one way to define it, right? Fewer than 50% of the people graduated from high school. Ooh, now there's a different one. And certainly that has changed in recent years, right? Cotton producing areas of the country. If you overlap all of these characteristics, look at the legend over there on the side. The darker the green, the more of these 6 things are true. Okay. And so you get out to South Florida, you get up into Northern Virginia, you go all the way out into the panhandle of Texas, and you find that only one of these things is true. But if you're in the deep, deep part of Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, you might find all 6 of these things, right? And then you might consider states that you never even thought of. Look at that. It goes all the way up into Pennsylvania. That's not the South, is it? Right? It goes up into southern Indiana, southern Ohio, southern Illinois. Is that really the South? It goes all the way out into Oklahoma. A lot of country music superstars nowadays, they're from Oklahoma. Is that really the South? So you think about it. It's perception, right? It's a little bit of how we interpret some of these, these quantitative pieces of data that can sometimes be qualitative. So when we think about cultural environments, and of course we know the places where we don't live, the too hot, the too cold, the too wet, the too dry, the too rocky, right? But obviously your environment is going to affect all kinds of things, the kinds of clothing you wear, right? The type of house that you build, right? As you watch in human geography, you're going to see that if people have wood, they usually make their house out of wood. Where they don't have wood, they can't make a house out of wood. So they're going to use some other type of building material, maybe rock or stone, right? So when we think about recreational activities, right? If you play ice hockey, you're probably in a cold climate, right? But can we adapt stimulus diffusion, and can we play roller blade hockey, right? So when we think about how environment affects all of these things, environment affects our food, environment affects our language, environment affects our religion, it affects everything, right? So we know from Unit 1 that we talked a lot about cultural ecology. We talked about human environment interaction. So I'm not going to spend too long talking about determinism or possibilism, but you can take a chance and you can maybe pause the slide here, read through that. We're going to talk about Frederick Ratzel's organic theory when we get to the unit on political geography. Carl Sauer, a very famous American cultural geographer, especially in the 1960s, right? He was kind of this idea maker of the idea of possibilism, that humans could overcome the limitations of the environment, right? So I'll give you a second. You can go ahead and read the slide and I'll pick back up with you. Okay, so when we think about environmental determinism versus possibilism, you look at this family in East Africa, right? And you look at certainly some traditional technologies, right? As they grind up their grain, right? In the mortar and pestle, right? But then at the same time, you've got this, mirrored dish where they're able to cook using solar power. The solar rays hit the mirror panels and it focuses all the heat on their dinner, right? You got the taste tester over there in the corner, right? He's in charge of the quality, making sure everything tastes right. So when you think about this, you see traditional clothing, right? You certainly see traditional architectural styles, right? So this is what I mean by the world is you can't paint everybody with the same brush, right? You can't say that everybody is either fully into the technological modern world or that they're all completely stuck in the traditional world of the past, right? The reality is that things are changing all over the world all the time. The same thing if you go to the Middle East and you find out that when you get to, say, Dubai, that they've got an indoor snow skiing area. It's 120 degrees outside, but I can go buy a couple of lift tickets and I can ski all afternoon long, right? And imagine how much money it takes to make this place cold enough. Look at those air conditioning units up there on the ceiling. How much cold air has got to be pumping out into this place, right? But again, possibilism, right? Okay, what kinds of types of culture can we have? Again, a lot of vocab in Unit 3, so bear with me on this. We've got local culture, right? The kind that is identifiable to a collective community, a tight-knit group of people. If it's a rural area, we sometimes prefer the term folk culture. These two words are not completely interchangeable, but make sure you know that they're at least kind of symbiotic with each other, right? A local culture is a small group of people, oftentimes in an urban ethnic neighborhood, for example. Okay. A folk culture is going to be a group of people, often in a rural area, who again are tightly knit by their traits and by their customs. Okay. Obviously, they want to preserve their identity. They don't want to lose their customs. They don't want to be blended in to some bigger identity where they're going to get lost. So they try to retain their identity. Now, pop culture, very different. This is the TikTok world, right? This is the here today, gone tomorrow. It's a flash in the pan. It's a one-hit wonder. It's the silly bands that you wore in elementary school, right? It's heterogeneous. It applies to everybody. It's spread through technology, right? It's a bunch of celebrities telling you how you should dress. And these influencers, right? The hairstyles that are it and in, right? Remember Ugg boots, right? All of these kinds of things, right? Spread not just by the traditional mass media, but especially by social media, right? Material culture are things that you can touch, right? here's one example of material culture right here, your phone. And that is certainly a big, diffusion vehicle. Ideas and innovations can spread through your phone, right? Material culture are things that are tangible, right? When archaeologists dig up a civilization thousands of years later, they're going to find artifacts, right? Now, non-material culture won't be the artifacts. It'll be the mentifacts, the things that are in your mind, right? Slang terminology, your moral compass, ways of greeting each other, right? Your faith, right? The songs that you know by heart, right? The prayers that you remember from when you were a little kid, right? All of these things are part of your mentifacts. Now, sometimes if the idea is the whole society's mentefact, you might see somebody call it a sociofact. Like we say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. It's drilled into us from a young age. It's a sociofact, right? So mentefacts are non-material. Artifacts are material things like clothing, right? Like tools and furniture, right? And then those sociofacts are the things that apply to the whole group of people, right? So when we think about the Amish, we certainly got a lot of artifacts there, right? We got the buggy, right? We got the clothing, we got the hats, right? But the sociofacts and the mentefacts are also important too. The aversion to using technology. But look carefully at this picture. Even these folk cultures sometimes have to yield to the modern world. Look at the reflectors, right? Look at the little reflectors on the buggy, because by law, the political government is now saying, the state or the county or whatever is saying, you've got to have reflectors on these buggies if you're going to be out on the public highways and roadways, right? So this is what we're talking about. You remember this guy? All right. I'm pretty sure when you guys were like in 5th grade, this was super wildly popular, right? Psy with his Gangnam Style video. Oppa Gangnam Style, right? Okay. This is pop culture. I mean, honestly, what is he doing right now other than counting all of his money in Seoul, right? And certainly K-pop has become so much bigger, mostly because of this guy, right? K-pop was kind of out there on the fringes of society until Psy made Korea really recognizable and well known to most generalized American audiences. And now we've got K-pop superstars, right? All over the world. So when we think about pop culture, right? Again, it's heterogeneous. It applies to everybody, and it spreads especially through technology. Think about old school rappers, right? The hip hop originators. We talked about cultural hearths. There are 4 distinct hearths of hip hop music in the United States, mostly coming from urban Black areas of the United States, right? Hip hop and rap was a literature art form, right? Of the Black identity, right? Describing life and describing their society, right? And certainly New York City is one of those hearth areas. You've got the area of the Midwest from basically Detroit through Chicago. You've got the West Coast for sure, California, Southern California. Remember what Tupac told us, California knows how to party, right? And then, of course, you got the dirty South, right? That area of Atlanta coming down towards Miami, right? And these hearth areas are recognizable and identifiable by the artists that come from each area, right? The same genre of music, but all with a little bit of a difference, right? Because of geography. Remember, geography is everything, and everything is geographical, okay? So when we think about internet, the internet certainly has an effect on this. And you see that access to the internet is exploding in the developing world, but it's already huge in the richer, more developed, economically well-off parts of the world. Now, of course, English is a big part of this, right? Because the internet to this day is still overwhelmingly English-based, but even that is changing as the local vernacular languages are becoming more increasingly able to be found on the internet as well. You can find websites in Mandarin, websites in Hindi, websites in Turkish, right? Websites in Portuguese, right? So when we see the spread of the internet, it's changing access and connectivity for everyone. So when we think about pop culture, fashion is a great example of this. You might have a fashion designer, right, who creates this new look. Right. Oftentimes it's from Milan, darling. Right. And it's going to, be on the runways, and you're going to see the designer, the innovator is going to hire the best looking models to wear their clothes. Right. And these models will be the trend setters. And oftentimes they'll get some big famous person, a movie star, or a musician, or an athlete. Right. And they'll use the product or wear the product or demonstrate the product. Think about Beats by Dr. Dre. Right? Remember how Dr. Dre got those beats to be so popular? Oh, I don't know. Let's get LeBron to wear them. Right? And then everybody, oh my God. Sorry, Miami people. I know LeBron's still a sore subject for you. Okay. Get over it. The reality is, he still has a lot of this, influence, right? And he's an early adopter. Well, then you get the mass consumers. Oh my God, I'm gonna get them for Christmas. I gotta get those Beats by Dr. Dre, and everybody has them. And then we start getting the knockoff versions, right? Everybody can get them, except for those people that we call the laggards, the people that kind of never really adopt it. They really never catch on. They really kind of, I'm not really all that interested, right? In America, laggards generally fall into two categories: older people and poorer people, right? Because the older people they're not with it. Hello. and the poor people, they don't have the ability to chase after all of these things. Okay. But this is an example of pop culture in a hierarchical way. Do you know this guy? Right. I mean, most people know that that's Michael Jordan. Right. I know you're younger, but he really used to play basketball, before he made the Bugs Bunny movie, before he became a billionaire, before all of the other things that Michael Jordan has done since then. I'm old enough to remember I actually saw Michael Jordan play baseball in person for the AA Birmingham Barons in Orlando when they played against the Orlando Sunrays. I was in the stadium. It was packed. Michael Jordan playing baseball. He struck out 4 times. He sucked. It was terrible, right? But, when you think about Michael Jordan, I mean, this guy was it. And now there's a very vigorous debate. Is he still the greatest of all time, right? Does LeBron now deserve that same kind of, hey, 3 different teams have won titles with LeBron, right? Does LeBron now wear number 23? I wonder why, right? Think about it, right? In the 90s, they used to say that Michael Jordan was the most recognizable person on the earth, living or dead. Do you realize how recognizable you have to be for that, right? I mean, we're talking more recognizable than Muhammad, Jesus, Buddha, right? More recognizable than cults of personality, like FDR, JFK, right? Evil people like Adolf Hitler, Attila the Hun, Mao Zedong. I mean, you imagine, bigger than the Beatles. I mean, can you imagine the most recognizable person, living or dead? So I always wonder to myself, if we did it today, maybe would it be David Beckham, or has he already started to become kind of irrelevant, right? I mean, I know he's big in Miami because he's got a soccer team down there now, but he married a Spice Girl, and he's got like those good looks. Damn him, those good looks, right? And of course, they made a movie with his name in the title. Can you bend it like Beckham? So then I thought, if he's a little bit too passé, if he's a little bit behind the times, then do we say, well, what if it's Messi? Except, his teammate married Shakira. Well, can you imagine if Messi had married Shakira instead? How big he would be? Like A-Rod with J-Lo, right? And then there's the kids that go, what about Cristiano Ronaldo? Okay, we're not getting into that debate. Just be appreciative of the fact that their 2 best players are playing together at the same time, and you're getting to watch it all, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember Pele, and I'm old enough to remember, Diego Maradona. They didn't exactly play at the same time. You've got the 2 best, and they're going head to head. Everything you can do, I can do better, right? And of course, I probably should have gone out and found a picture of Ronaldo flexing for you guys, but we'll live with Messi. So what do we know about these cultural terms? We have the customs, right? We have the traits, the things that we do. But sometimes people take your traits and then they use them for their own purposes. They make money. You know who's really good at that? Disney. They take all these princess stories from all over the world and they turn them into movies, and they make lunchboxes and Halloween costumes and stuffed animals, and then they sell you tickets to the park, and then they've got the soundtrack that goes with the movie, and now they've got the Disney Channel on TV, and they got Disney satellite radio, and you have to buy your subscription to Sirius XM, and you know what I'm talking about? They're making a lot of money off stuff that they didn't even create. They're just taking somebody else's creation. Sometimes people can get upset by that cultural appropriation. You're taking our culture and you're making money off of it. There have been big lawsuits recently about, the Native American nicknames, right? The Washington football team just underwent a name change. Right now they're called the Washington football team because they can't be called that name anymore, right? Because it's offensive to Native Americans. So a lot of colleges had to give up their Native American mascot names. But one that did not, right? The Seminole Indians of Florida. They were like, no. Don't take away the name from FSU. We want them to be the Seminoles. I don't know if you guys know this, but the kid on the horse before the game that throws the flaming spear in the ground, that kid is on a full scholarship at FSU, but they have to be, right? Seminole Indian. They have to be from that Miccosukee tribe of Seminole Indians of Florida, but they get a full ride scholarship to go to FSU and represent Native American identity. Okay. So the process by which something obtains value is what we call commodification. A couple of years ago, there was a piece of toast that came out of a toaster, and the lady said that it had the image of Jesus on the toast, and people were spending, millions of dollars at auction to buy this. There was a sandwich that Barack Obama had taken a bite out of. Woo! Let's bid a lot of money for that, right? This is where you take like a jersey that an athlete has worn and you say, oh my God, the shirt is worth like what, $20? But if Zlatan wore it, oh my God, I'm going to pay $20,000 for that jersey. It becomes commodified. Kind of like your work, your time becomes commodified if you're a babysitter, right? If you do odd jobs around the house, we put a value on that, right? How much do you pay your math tutor, right? That's commodification. And then we think, of course, assimilation, where the minority culture has just kind of lost its identity altogether. We talked about that earlier. All right. Authenticity is a big word with culture. Is it real? Like an Irish pub, right? Is it authentic? A Mexican restaurant, right? When you go in, is there going to be like cheap mariachi music playing, or is it going to be real? The chips and the salsa, is it going to come from a can or a jar? Or is it going to be authentic? Is it going to be really, really well done? The same thing with any kind of ethnic restaurant, whether it's Indian food, whether it's Ethiopian food, right? Whether it's Indonesian food, is it authentic, right? Taco Bell, not authentic, right? So when you think about authenticity, we take those stereotypes and we kind of say, oh, let's put this to the test. Is this real? Now, certainly in the world today, globalization is a big deal. Transportation and communication are making hey, Disney was right. It really is a small world after all. Yeah. And so we see that some people, they love globalization, right? They love the fact that you can, interact with economies all over the world, right? Economically, culturally, spread of English. It's great when we travel as Americans that people all over the world are learning English because they feel like they have to cater to American tourists in order to get our dollars. But the reality is that a good thing that we're wiping out indigenous identities? I don't know. Certainly globalization can be rejected by people. Oh, I don't want to get, tangled up in all this worldly things. I'm just going to kind of keep to my own little localized or nationalized self-identity. Some people in the world get angry and they fight back against this idea of homogenization. Sometimes cultures can say, well, we're losing our identity and we're going to fight to keep our identity. We don't want to be washed up in your identity. So when we think about globalization, though, we talked about the Native Americans, for example. They get really upset when you use their mascot names. But, hey, we can open a big casino, right? I don't know if you guys know, but the Hard Rock, right, hotel chain that's owned by the Miccosukee tribe of Seminole Indians of Florida. Right? You could go all around the world to any Hard Rock in the world, and you're going to find Seminole Indian things inside that Hard Rock restaurant and hotel and the casinos, right? Because they have a special deal with the American government where they get to have their, casinos and they get to keep all the money. And, they're a sovereign entity in that sense. We see, of course, the syncretism. You guys know the word sync. Like if you sync things on your phone, right, and you drop it onto your laptop or vice versa, right? We know what hybrids are, because we know about hybrid cars. So hybridity is when we blend things. Syncretism is when we're blending things. Transculturation, we're blending things. Certainly acculturation is self-selectively blending things. But remember, assimilation, you lose your identity altogether. We define ourselves by communities and our places. Remember, I told you about sense of place. You kind of look around and you go, yeah, hey, can you tell that in this room, by the way, I've been shunted into Michael's room to make this video, but, can you tell that Michael's dad is a geography educator? It's like, he's got all these maps in his room. He's got his little King Tut thing there in the background when we went to Egypt when Michael was 10, So, but, we get a sense of place. And we say, oh, okay, he probably likes sports. He likes the Marlins. He's a Florida Gator, right? You go around, you look around. He was in the band. You got a lot of things, right? When you think about placelessness, think about the mall. They all look the same. I mean, if I took you to any mall in America and blindfolded you and then kind of spun you around in the food court and said, okay, where are you? You wouldn't know, because you're going to see a Chick-fil-A and you're going to see a Sbarro's and you're going to see all the other kind of food court places. And then you're going to see the Apple Store, and there's going to be a Victoria's Secret, and there's going to be, the anchor chains that are there. Now, maybe the anchor chains might be different. That might be a little bit of a giveaway, right? But the reality is malls and suburbs in America have become kind of placeless. They've lost their uniqueness. They're not special, okay? We call that placelessness. But most times, resistance to globalization is pretty futile. It's kind of like trying to stop Messi. By the way, it's an old picture of Messi. He was wearing number 19 when he was younger, right? So let's move on. Let's talk more about identity, right? Race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, lots of different identities in cultural geography. So the historical and cultural impact of this, right? Unfortunately, we have used skin color as humans for so long. There is absolutely no biological basis for dividing humans on the presence of their skin color and their appearance. It's a poor predictor of who somebody is, okay? We know that melanin in your skin reacts with sunlight, and that makes your skin either lighter or darker. Can you tell that my historical people came from the northern hemisphere at the highest of latitudes? I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but when you look at Ireland by its appearance, a lot of red hair, a lot of freckles, a lot of blue eyes, a lot of very pale skinned people, right? That's, when you do those DNA, my 23andMe and all those ancestry.coms and you find out where you're from, not too much of a shock, right? Where Spatial Shark's family is from. But of course, in today's world, we see a lot of blending even here, right? Where we have families that are, a blend, parents of different ethnic backgrounds, right? Michael and Katie, we label them as Hispanic, right? I mean, they are, their mother is, right? So we have kids who are blended racially, blended religiously, blended linguistically, right? So it's very common for us now to see that the world is a lot more alike than it is different, right? And it's sad that society has always tried to find differences when it would be nice if we would look to seek to find commonalities, okay? We think all the times about how race makes differences. What I will tell you as a geographer is oftentimes what you think is race is really more often about place, right? So it's not about white, black. It's not about Hispanic or Latino, right? It's not about gay or straight. It's not about, Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Jewish or Buddhist, right? It's about where you're from and how that affects your identity and who you are, okay? So place is a powerful thing, right? When you look at our school, what's our place? Our school is in a very high income area, a very highly educated area, full of parents who do a lot of professional type jobs. They're doctors, they're engineers, they're accountants, they're attorneys, right? And that's why there's a lot of pressure on you guys to do well, because there's the expectation that you're going to meet those high standards, right? And even if you don't come from that wealthiest of backgrounds, right? There's an incredible opportunity at a school like we have to be a high achieving kid and to get into those competitive, elite, selective kinds of universities. Hey, you know, when we really do a good job on the AP exam, it continues to make our school very well known. And colleges recognize, hey, that kid at Spanish River, ooh, okay, that's a kid we want to take, right? As opposed to maybe kids that come from other schools that maybe don't have that outstanding reputation. That's why when you take all these FSAs and EOCs and all these kinds of tests, we want you guys to be excelling, right? Because it benefits all of you that we're in a school, that we're a high achieving school of distinction and a school of excellence. Okay. So we think about all of these things in terms of the impact, the historical impact of these diffusions and these identities. So there's a really cool website. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's called Where the Hell is Matt? And Matt loves to dance. And so he goes all around the world. This happens to be in Papua New Guinea, which is just north of Australia. It's the eastern half of the New Guinea island. The western half belongs to Indonesia. The eastern half is its own independent country. This is the most linguistically divided place in the world. There's over 800 unique, distinct languages being spoken in Papua New Guinea. I don't know if you can figure out who Matt is in this picture. I think you can figure it out. But Matt travels around the world, and the one thing he always does is he dances with local people, because he says, you know, dancing is one of those things that everybody in the world does. Maybe we do it differently, right? We can't all do the lambada like they do in Brazil, right? But the reality is that people love to dance. So Matt will go around the world and he'll take pictures dancing with people, right? You can follow him on his website. You can find out where he is. It's called Where the Hell is Matt? So when we think about what our differences are, then what are our real differences? I mean, people say, oh, we have racial differences. Well, I just told you skin color is a terrible predictor of who somebody is. We say we have ethnic differences, right? But the reality is when we're fighting, we're usually fighting about land. We're not really fighting about our differences. We're fighting about who owns the piece of property that both of us want. We can talk about religious differences, but remember that, you know, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all believe in the same God. We know that Hindus and Buddhists are very, very similar. We know that Buddha and Jesus were very similar in what they taught, right? So when we think about differences, are we really all that different? We talk about national differences, differences of our country, right? But again, usually that's caught up in fighting over land. We think about cultural differences, right? Whether it's, you know, linguistic, or whether it's, you know, different, you know, groups of immigrants that have moved into a country, right? The reality is that a lot of times these differences are kind of invented, you know, and this is one of the most beautiful thing about children is that when you're little, you don't know these differences. You guys remember, you're the generation that grew up with a purple dinosaur that told you to love everybody, right? It's only when you get older that you're kind of taught that, oh, these people are different, these people are better, these people are worse, you know, oh, this and that. You know, the reality is children have a brilliant innocence about all of that, right? Again, you can take a look and read some of these historical references that I put here for you, right? And certainly we're going to talk more about these, all right? And certainly when you read the David Palmer Blue Book, you'll see some of these examples as well. But I'll give you a second to look at the slide, and I'll pick you back up in a few seconds. Okay, so when we think about Yugoslavia, the breakup of Yugoslavia, today we have countries like Serbia, right? Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo is its own independent country now. We see that there was this breakup, Macedonia, Montenegro, right? There used to be one country that was all Slavic, right? Yugoslavia was the land of the Southern Slavs, right? For example, Serbs and Croats, theoretically, guys, that's the same language, although they will now swear and tell you, no, there's two different languages, right? But most people outside of this region of the world will say Serbo-Croatian is one language, you know, but they're telling you that they're growing apart. And the country has split. Really horrific civil war in the 1990s. Guys, that's not that long ago. I know you weren't born, right? But this is something that created a huge refugee crisis in Europe in the 1990s, right? Remember, we just talked about refugees in Unit 2, towards the end of Unit 2. So when we think about racism, and let's be honest, this is something that is still happening in the United States, right? Despite the fact that all humans are one single species, we're all Homo sapiens sapiens, we're all 99.8% genetically identical, right? But we allow these divisions to persist. And think about it, the United States, the land of the free, the home of the brave, Don't forget, we enshrined in our Constitution the fact that blacks were 3/5 of a person. Think about that. 3/5 compromise, right? Should we count the slaves or not? And then remember that when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he didn't free every slave with that document. He only freed the slaves that were in Southern territory that the Union Army didn't control. Because remember, politically, he didn't want to free the slaves in the states that the Northern armies were controlling, because he was afraid that that would create animosity and prolong the war even more, right? So we know that politics plays a role in all of this stuff. The Jim Crow laws of the South, right? The whole separate but equal fallacy. The conditions were always separate. They were never equal, right? You remember Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, right? We know Brown versus Topeka Board of Education in 1954 supposedly integrated, but I don't know if you guys know the history here locally. Palm Beach County schools didn't integrate immediately. Palm Beach County schools weren't fully integrated until almost 1970. And it took another lawsuit here locally for it to finally happen. That's why our downtown our downtown academic offices, it's known as the Fulton Holland Educational Center. Fulton and Holland were the two plaintiffs and the defendant in the court case that fully integrated Palm Beach County schools. It wasn't that long ago, right? I was born in 1969, right? Palm Beach County schools still integrating into the year 1970. Right? So we think about Black Lives Matter today, and we think about, no room for racism. And we think about the issues that surround, right, policing in communities, right? We think about the issues around opportunities, right? Educational opportunities, economic opportunities. And again, it's like I tell you guys all the time, certainly things are way better than they've ever been before. But I don't know that we could ever argue that it's ever going to be good enough. Can't we always try to be a little bit better? And it's not just with race, it's also with gender, right? And it's with sexual orientation, right? And it's with, immigration and national identities. Okay? Think about in the case of segregation, right? With Black Americans, there was always two kinds of segregation. There's what they call de jure, which is based in the legal system, right? Like the Jim Crow laws of the South, like the separate but equal of Plessy versus Ferguson. And then there's de facto segregation, where the law is gone, but the law doesn't change in other people's minds. I don't know if you guys know Bruce Hornsby and the Range, right? There's a great song you can go look up, right? So when de facto segregation happens, that's the persistent kind. That's the kind that it's hard to get rid of, right? That's the kind where people still kind of believe it and they internalize it, even though the law has struck it down. Okay. So when we think about the Great Migration, this also did a lot to desegregate the United States in the sense that, African Americans moved out of the Deep South, partly because of push factors, right? The Jim Crow laws and the racism of the South pushed them away. But then there was also the economic pull of job opportunities in the North and in the West. But of course, it's also ridiculous to assume that when they got to the big cities of the North that they didn't experience any racism there, right? It happened in Chicago. It happened in Detroit. It happened in Philadelphia. It happened in Baltimore. It happened in Boston. It happened in Oakland. It happened in Los Angeles. It's happened everywhere. So we even see today that there's a return Great Migration where, the grandchildren of Black Americans who moved to the northern cities, some of them are coming back to the New South, the new economic opportunities of the South, to cities like Memphis and Atlanta, Charleston, South Carolina. I don't know if you guys have heard about Charleston, South Carolina. Look it up. It is exploding economically with opportunities. Places like Houston, Texas, Dallas, Texas, right? All right. Before Katrina, New Orleans was very vibrant, right? So when we think about these places, right, these are the new economic boom towns, right, of this new America. And we know that historically, this white man's burden, as Europeans, felt superior and colonized Asia and Africa and Latin America, and these imperial massive land masses of the British and the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese, right? We know that all of that has kind of fallen by the wayside. But sometimes those things persisted, right? We see the apartheid government of South Africa that didn't collapse until the 1990s. We took kids to South Africa not even 2 years ago, just before the COVID realities have set in. We went to South Africa for our spring break trip in 2019. And for kids to go into Cape Town and Johannesburg, and we walked through the shanty towns, the squatter settlements, the slum areas. I'm telling you, you think you know poverty? You've never seen poverty until you walk through a shanty town in South Africa. But these children are some of the happiest kids you've ever seen, right? And again, the whole idea is that they're trying to get an education and trying to get out, right? Trying to make a better life, okay? So when we think about this great migration in the United States, there's that movement. Remember, North and West in the Great Migration. It's never been an AP exam question about this migration, this voluntary migration using the push and the pull factors that I described. So if we don't like the word race, because we don't, right, then what do we mean by ethnicity? And this is also sometimes vague and hard to define. After all, what does it mean to be Hispanic? Right? This new term that everybody likes to use of Latinx, because we don't want to say Latino or Latina, because then that becomes gender specific. So we say Latinx, right? Or Hispanic. So are they all the same? For the first time ever, the 2010 census, if you said you were Hispanic, they followed it up with another question. Which country in the Hispanic world do you identify with? Are you Cuban? Are you Mexican? Are you Colombian? Are you Peruvian? Are you Chileno? Right? Are you Venezolano? Right? Are you Puerto Rican? Right? So we start to see that even in that big cultural realm, even in that big Latin American world, people still can divide and say, well, I'm different. I'm not like that over there. The reality is we're all more alike than we are different, but people persist on those divisions, right? So when the Greeks first came up with this idea, that's where the word comes from, ethnicity. It comes from the Greek word ethnos. It meant your identity. It meant your people. Who are your people? When I grew up in Tennessee, that's what my grandparents always used to say. You'd go to like family reunions and you'd meet some old person. You had no idea who they were, but they apparently knew you, right? And they'd be like, where are your people? It's like, where are your people? That's your ethnos, right? That's your ethnic identity. Sometimes we talk about ethno-nationalism. Right? This is a big issue like in Nigeria, where they have like 500 tribes of different people living as Nigerians. Well, what makes you Nigerian? Right? When your identity, you think of yourself as Hausa or Yoruba or Igbo, right? And we think of ourselves as Americans, but do we tribalize and do we divide ourselves into these ethnoses, right? These smaller groups. So we know that ethnicity is shared traits. We have a common history. We choose this identity, right? Remember, you kind of choose to be American. And a lot of us, we like to hyphenate. And we say, oh, I'm Italian American, right? I'm Greek American, I'm Cuban American, right? So we choose our identity to a large degree. Our identity is sometimes picked for us by our family. Sometimes we might like to change our identity as we get older, right? But we all have this idea of place. And we have place names, what we call toponyms. Toponymy is the study of place names. And sometimes these place names tell us a lot about our origins. We've got Native American place names in Florida, like, Okeechobee and Tallahassee, right? We've got saint names in California, right? The San Diegos and the San Franciscos and the Los Angeleses, right? In Texas with Corpus Christi, right? The body of Christ. Right? When we think about the Sangre Cristo Mountains, the blood of Christ in New Mexico, right? The Grand Teton Mountains out in the far west. Right? And if you know anything about the Grand Tetons, the Grande Tetonas, right? I'm not going to really tell you too much about what that means, but I think you can figure it out. A lot of lonely explorers saw mountains over on the distance and said, mira, Grande Tetonas, right? They were missing the ladies. So when we think about toponyms, it tells us the rich history of who we are as a people, as an ethnos, gives us a sense of place. So ethnic groups, oftentimes, they choose to segregate. They live in these ethnic neighborhoods, right? They have these ethnic islands in big cities, right? And you find the Chinatowns and the Koreatowns and the little Italies, right? And the little Havanas, like in Miami, where you can go hang out at Versailles and you see all the viejos playing, domino. So what's happening in the United States in terms of this race and ethnicity, most of you guys already know this, but when we think about population statistics, white Americans are becoming less and less and less and less and less and less of the population. We're still a plurality, people who look like me. But the reality is, Americans are starting to look a lot different, right? There was a really cool book from a geography professor at the University of North Carolina a few years ago, and he had a whole topic in there. We saw him as a guest speaker at the AP reading one night, and he talked about the browning of America, right? How America is not as white as it used to be. By the way, suburbs are not as white and wealthy as they used to be. Suburbs used to be a phenomenon of white flight, where people left the cities and went out to the suburbs. That's not so true anymore, because a lot of times immigrants now go straight to the suburbs. They don't go to the ethnic island in the middle of the inner city, right? So a lot of this is changing, right? And certainly we see the blend of both quantitative and qualitative data, because we can look at the statistics, or as a geographer, we can go into these neighborhoods and start, asking questions. What made you want to live here? Have you ever wanted to leave, right? Did your kids go away to college? If so, do they ever intend to come back? Once you start asking those questions, that's qualitative geospatial data. It's no longer quantitative, right? It has a value of quality because it depends on the source, depends on where you're getting the information from. This is what happens a lot of times with immigrant groups. They move into this ethnic neighborhood, and they take a little small piece of the city, and they adjust, and they learn English, and they become a little more acculturated. They don't lose their identity. But what happens is that they encourage their kids, and I know this happened a lot with my wife's family, where her parents were like, oh, no, you got to learn English, and you got to become Americanized, and you got to get out of the ethnic neighborhood, and you get intermarriage, where hot Cubans marry gringos from Tennessee, and then they end up with two kids who are kind of these blended realities, right? And then C is like, oh, bisabuela, we want you to learn Spanish, Michael and Katie, because you have to be able to talk with Bisa, right? We want you to be able to communicate. And so you reconnect with the ethnic pocket, right? With the ethnic neighborhood. This is happening all over America. The first generation, the second generation, the third generation. Because sadly, the third generation, sometimes you completely lost who it is that you used to be, right? The grandparents who came to America, the parents who changed what it was to be American, and then the grandchildren who say, gee, I don't know anything about my Greek heritage, right? I've never had Greek food. I've never had, I've never been to Greece, right? This is what happens with a lot of immigrant groups, right? And so they rediscover what it is to be that ethnicity. Certainly in Miami, this is a big example, right? Because there's areas of Miami that are very Anglo, and there's areas of Miami that are totally Hispanic. There are areas of Miami that are very Jewish, like in Miami Beach. There's areas of Miami that are Haitian. There's areas of Miami that are Brazilian. There's areas of Miami that are not the Cuban Hispanics, but now the newer Venezuelans that have moved in, right? So everything is always in this constant state of flux. They sometimes call this invasion and succession, right? The group will come in, and then they'll become dominant. The old group moves out, and it's sequence occupants, something that we learned way back in Unit 1. So as we shift gears one more time, let's start talking about our gender and sexuality part of identity. So what is it that exactly we mean by gender? We're not talking about sex. We're not talking about the biological pieces and parts. We're talking about the feeling, the identification of gender, right? And so when we think about this in the United States, legally, this is changing. It wasn't all that long ago that gay marriage was against the law in every state. Now, in many states, right, it has been protected by law. But there's still discrimination, right? There are still episodes where people are intolerant of others, okay? So when we think about gender, even in heterosexual normative relationships, where you say, okay, husband and wife, the male and female roles, the mom and the dad, the husband and the wife, right? Who stays home with the kids when you're sick? Who works outside the home more? Who has more of the share of the household domestic work, right? And what does it mean? You think about that word heteronormative, right? The idea that straight is somehow normal and that not straight is somehow not normal, because that has been the norm, heteronormative, right? But isn't that only just because it's the majority, right? And so when we think about the gender-related development index, you can actually measure women's access to income, to educational attainment, to life expectancy, to health, wealth, and education. And this shows us gender inequality. By the way, even in the United States, we still have gender inequality. Right? It's certainly better than most other places in the world. The best gender inequality, or the least amount of it, is actually in Northern Europe, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland. Right there, you have almost complete gender equality. There's also a thing called the gender empowerment measure, where it measures women's opportunities in terms of executive roles in companies, parliamentary positions, running for government office, right? Do women have positions of power, right? And again, the gender empowerment measure is an interesting statistic to look at. How do we see gender, right? Are we taught gender from a young age? You look at, for example, these two t-shirts. And these are just two t-shirts from a Walmart that I found online. And you look at the boys' t-shirt, the blue one at the top, be a hero. And you look at the girls' t-shirt on the bottom, I need a hero. Right? Why can't the girl be the hero? Maybe the boy needs a hero sometimes, right? But we see gender, whether you're going to play with the trucks or whether you're going to play with the dolls, right? We sometimes see gender, right? And it's kind of like this, again, this heteronormative sense of gender. Think about how Halloween costumes. As Halloween quickly approaches, and we always do this slideshow right around the time that Halloween is around the corner. If you go to Party City and you look for a costume, how is it that there's, you're looking for a cop costume, for example? Well, if you're a guy, there's a certain costume. And if you're a girl, oh, wait, why is the costume for the girl always kind of objectified, right? Why can't the girl have a costume that is not hypersexualized? But this is the reality. And I dare you to go to Party City and check it out. It's pretty true, right? So when we think about how we see gender, it is changing, right? But it's not quite equal yet. So if you look at the more, and I don't make fun of my disability, blue, purple, whatever color that highest category is, 0.9 and above, that means that they're like 90% gender equivalent in terms of access to health, wealth, and education. Certainly the least colors there would be the least access. Now, we talked about this in class. What if we overlaid using GIS like a lasagna and we stuck a map of total fertility rate on the top of this? Could you write me an essay about how gender development and total fertility are connected to each other? You should be able to do that by now. Wouldn't that be a great essay question to get on your AP exam this year? I wonder, right? And then you look at the gender empowerment measure, right? Where again, are women empowered? Do they have opportunities? The top 10 over there on the left-hand side. Remember I told you Northern Europe was much, much farther along, right? Even much more farther along than the United States. After all, think about it, guys. We've had one woman run for president on a major ticket. We've had 3 women as vice presidential candidates, including the current one, right? No one in terms of, winning the presidency, not really, Hillary, of course, winning the popular vote, losing the electoral vote, right? That's the closest we've come. So we don't have anywhere close to gender empowerment in terms of the United States, right? And certainly not in terms of high-level executive jobs and pay. That's not the same, right? The United States women's national soccer team has been fighting a court battle for years with the U.S. Soccer Federation saying, wait a second, we've won the World Cup 5 times. The guys, they suck. They don't win anything. How come they get paid more than we do? How come they fly first class and we don't? And you look at the women's soccer team and you say, they kind of have a point. They they're certainly better than the guys. And of course, the U.S. Soccer Federation will say, well, yeah, but who sells more tickets? Right? Where's the revenue? Where's the money? And this becomes a fight about gender empowerment. Caster Semenya, the athlete in the center of your screen there, is from South Africa. She burst onto the scene at the Berlin. It was not the Olympics. It was one of those kind of off Olympic cycle, Commonwealth Games kind of things. And she won the women's 800 meters, and she absolutely shattered the world record. And something happened that doesn't always happen in female athletics. People said that the reason why she was so good, she must be a man, right? There must be some reason, there must be some advantage that she has, that she's defeating all these other ladies. And they went so far as to undergo what they call gender detection testing, where they forced her to submit to the idea that they're going to make sure that she's female, right? So Caster Semenya, only one recent example of how athletes are sometimes subjected to the same gender discriminations, right? And we see this in athletics, as well as in business, as well as in politics, as well as in many arenas of life. So we know that in terms of health, demography, and vulnerability, we know that in many, many countries of the world, there is a gap between the male and the female reality. Okay, we know that this happens in longevity, life expectancy. Women almost always live longer than men in rich countries, but in poor countries, not so much. We know that men tend to marry women who are younger than they are, particularly if it's the second marriage. We know that when there's a wild age gap in marriage, it usually means that it's not as much of an equal partnership in the marriage, right? We know that family planning is not always as commonly practiced in the poorest parts of the world, where infant mortality is the highest, fertility is also the highest. We know that that affects quality of life. We know that there's maternal mortality, where women die during childbirth, particularly in places where there's a lack of hygienic, sanitized birth facilities. We know that in some countries, maternal mortality rates can be as high as 650 women out of 100,000 dying during childbirth. By the way, in the United States, that number is 3. So women are almost always worst off in the least developed countries of the world. But even in rich countries, elderly women are usually vulnerable, right? In the poorest countries, it's often little girls who are the most vulnerable. But regardless of where in the world we're talking about, remember what we've been saying. And you've seen it in the videos I've shown you. You've seen it in the discussions we've had. Everywhere in the world, things are getting better than they have been, for sure. Okay, so life expectancy, we know about the statistics there. Where it's red, females live a lot longer than males. Where it's that bluish color, it's either equal or sometimes women live even less than men do. And of course, family planning has a lot to do with fertility. And where you see family planning is used the least, we know that fertility is the most, right? Where your family planning is used a lot, we know that fertility is very low, right? Sometimes even less than 2 children per woman. And remember, to have replacement level fertility, you need 2.1 children, because the 0.1 accounts for infant mortality. And some kid will always ask, how do you have 0.1 of a child? It's an average. Get over it. So we know that family and social conditions don't always show us statistics. This is qualitative data, not necessarily quantitative data. We know that in the past, there has been some practices where women and girls are vulnerable and subject to very brutal conditions like foot binding in ancient China, female genitalia mutilation, what they call female circumcision, that's practiced very, very commonly still throughout some parts of East Africa. And so we see that even when you have female empowerment, it can sometimes result in something like divorce. And we don't think of divorce as being a good consequence, but the reality is divorce only happens where women have status and empowerment to be able to get out of a marriage. We know that education is really the key to all of this. Remember, Malala got shot in the face because she wanted to go to school so bad, right? And I've taught you so much about girl education and how important it is in all kinds of aspects of development, right? And again, things are getting better all over the world in that regard. So We talked about female circumcision there very briefly. This map just shows you the places where it is still practiced, and in some cases at a very, very high rate of practice. Very traditional areas of these countries, very much not in the urban parts, but in the rural parts where traditional values are still deeply rooted. We know that education, of course, undoes all of these traditions. And you can see that girl education, even in places that we think of as being very, very underdeveloped economically or even socially, we know that, again, opportunities are coming and things are changing. We know that school enrollment is now in many parts of the world almost equal or even in favor of women. Right? There are some parts of the world where there are more females enrolled in school than males. When I showed you the video earlier this year, the Hans Rosling video, Tangina's school in Bangladesh, the government pays families to keep their daughters in school longer because they know that girls who are educated are better off for the economy of the country. They're going to make more money, right? More money means more taxes. More taxes means more social programs. It's better for families. It's better for women. It's better for the economy. We know that literacy is a big part of that, right? Education for girls is going to undo many of these imbalances and inequalities. We know that when women work in the economy, right? I said that it impacts society as well, right? If we valued the work that mom does, because let's be honest, I see the work that mom does. You couldn't afford your mother. That's what my mom used to tell us, and having lost my mom now more than a decade ago, just all of the things she used to say when we were kids. She'd find money in the laundry and she'd keep it and say, no, that's a gratuity. That was a tip, right? And I was like, Mom, that was like $20. Well, yeah, I'm worth it. That's what she would tell us. You can't afford me. I'm special. So when we think about the work that mom does, right, and certainly, again, gender roles are changing. Dads do more, right? Sometimes it's almost equal, not usually. Usually dad will say, I've seen mom's job. I don't really want mom's job, right? Mom has a much harder job than dad does. When we think about in sub-Saharan Africa, women are still 70% of them are the ones out there growing the food. The traditional roles of women in agriculture. They're the ones preparing the food. They're the ones that are storing the food. They're the ones that are getting the water. You saw that with Olivia and Andre when I showed you the video in Mozambique, right? We know that some older girls sometimes have to drop out of school because the family prefers to send the boys to school as opposed to the girls. Again, it's changing. It's getting better. We know that girls are oftentimes trapped in a cycle of poverty, right? We're going to watch some videos coming up soon. It's from a book called Half the Sky. It's really good. No country can inherit its full potential if only half of its citizens have opportunities, right? They call it Half the Sky. We know that there's pink-collar jobs that we generally think of as being kind of women's jobs, like nursing, secretarial work, right? Used to be teachers, right? Elementary teachers especially. You don't see too many male kindergarten teachers. But we know that women in corporate America still don't make equal amounts of money to men. So when we think about female income as a percentage of male income, the darkest color is the highest, but notice that starts at the number 60 cents on the dollar. And that's not equal, right? So when we think about power relationships, again, we think about who makes decisions and we think about who is, kind of in charge, right? We know that a lot of these things are gender related. We know that, body imagery is oftentimes kind of something that men created and that women had to kind of conform to, this idea of beauty and attractiveness, right? This Barbie-like imagery. We know that this doesn't just affect gender, but it can affect language, it can affect religion, it can affect ethnicity, it can be based on income levels, it can be based on gender, it can be based on all of these things, right? We talked about vulnerability, and we talked about girls especially being vulnerable in poor countries, right? So as you read this slide, right, take a second and just kind of think about all of the ways that we've kind of experienced this already in class this year, and I'll pick you back up in a second or two. Okay, so this story here, right, came from a news headline. You guys know that political cartoons oftentimes are ripped out of the headlines. And this was a case of a woman in a mall who was breastfeeding her baby in public. And the mall security and the mall managers basically were trying to get her kicked out because they said that it was publicly indecent that she was breastfeeding her child in the mall. And ironically, where this happened was right in front of a Victoria's Secret store. And it's like, wait a second, they're worried about people seeing the female anatomy? Hello. It's like, wow, it's right there. And the reality is, here's mom. And she's like, I'm doing what's natural here. My baby's hungry and I'm feeding my baby. And this was a big case that kind of blew up this idea of, the role of women and being a mother in public and public breastfeeding and these kinds of things, right? So when you think about gender, it's like race, it's like ethnicity, it's everywhere. It's pervasive. We see it all the time. So, two more little things to talk about, right? Little things like language and religion. Wow, not so little, are they? All right, so let's run through language real quick, then we'll finish up with religion, and I promise I'll try to get this done soon. Right? Remember, you do not have to watch these videos all at one time. Chunk it up, right? Maybe watch 20, 30 minutes at a time, maybe 10 or 15, depending on how much spatial shark you can handle at one sitting, right? So when we think about language, language is a systematic means of communication. We share ideas, we share feelings, we use conventionalized signs, gestures, marks, but especially articulate vocal sounds. Articulation, right? It requires your teeth, your tongue, your lips, your mouth. All right. That's why in Spanish, we sometimes say that a language is a lengua, your tongue, right? And that's why kings would cut out tongues of people in the ancient world so they couldn't speak. But think about your teeth. Think about how many times your tongue is striking your teeth, right? So when little kids lose their teeth, when they're small, they sound so cute without their teeth, right? But can you imagine if we were all trying to speak without our teeth? It would be a little hard. We know that animals can communicate, but do they really make articulate vocal sounds, right? When your dog barks, do you know the difference between the I need to go out because I have to pee bark versus the I'm hungry bark versus the you're bothering me bark, right? I mean, can we really totally understand? Can your dog translate Shakespeare, right? So when we think about animals, they don't have the same articulation capability. We know that languages are constantly changing. New words are being added, right? We get verbs like Google, right? You don't know something? Go Google it, right? How many companies become so big that their company name becomes a verb, right? We add new words all the time to our language. So we know that language is the heart of your identity. It's the heart of culture. We know that many nationality groups are vigorously protective of their language, the French particularly. French Canadians especially. Remember the license plate, Je me souviens. What are they supposed to remember? They're supposed to remember that they're Quebecois. That's what Je me souviens it means I remember, right? So when we think about pre-literate societies, they didn't have a written language. And this is the biggest threat today. I don't know if you guys know this. There's almost 7,000 languages in the world. They think half of them are going to be gone in the next 100 years because we got about 10 big killers. English is a killer. Spanish is a killer. Portuguese is a killer. French is a killer. Russian is a killer. Hindi in India is a killer, right? Chinese, Mandarin Chinese is a killer. Arabic is a killer of smaller languages. These indigenous people that speak these lesser used languages, their children are growing up, especially when you see public education, where education is going to be taught in the big language. That's what we mean by a killer language. It's wiping out linguistic diversity in the world. Something like 90% of the people in the world speak one of these few languages that you see on this slide. But yet there's 10% of the world speaks the other 6,000 and something languages, right? So when we think about these lesser used minority languages, right, how can they be revived, right? Well, first of all, you teach them to your kids. That's the number one way to transmit culture. Teach it to your children. But it can also be used to preserve identity. Remember, we said language is the heart of your identity. Languages can stimulate tourism. When we were in Wales and in Ireland and in Scotland, you don't just see English signs. The Irish and the Welsh and the Scottish, they love to present their own language. Even still, they're desperately holding on to their Scottish Gaelic languages, to their Welsh Brogue languages, to the Irish language, right? In Ireland, they're now teaching Irish in the school system again, right? Even though English is still the majority language of the school day, they want the kids to learn a little bit of Irish. It's part of who they are. So when we think about linguistic diversity, look at sub-Saharan Africa, right? Look at the diversity of linguistics. Not in the big countries, the big European countries. Those are monolingual countries. Everybody's pretty much speaking one language. You guys know the old joke, right? If you speak, you're a polyglot. If you speak two languages, you're bilingual. If you speak one language, you're an American, right? You think about it, it's usually pretty true, right? So in the big countries like the United States and European countries, you see a lot of monolingual, right? Brazil is almost all Portuguese speaking. Mexico is almost all Spanish speaking because they've kind of wiped out the indigenous languages underneath that majority. Whereas in Africa, it's still very much linguistically divided, which is why it's hard to build nations there. It's hard to nation build, right? Again, what does it mean to be Nigerian when you have 500 languages being spoken? So this is what we mean by linguistic. Remember, I told you Papua New Guinea is the most linguistically diverse place in the world. And it's not that we don't have a lot of languages in the United States. We do. We have a lot of immigration to the United States. A lot of people speak different languages. But 70% of the United States is speaking English only. Now, about 1 out of every 4, 1 out of every 5 kids is at home, and they're going to hear something other than English at home at least some of the time. And certainly you guys can figure out that ratio, right? Because many of you are at home hearing something other than English. Michael and Katie Turner sometimes hear something other than English, usually when their grandparents are here. So you look at Brazil. Yeah, there's a lot of indigenous people, but it only represents something like 3% of the population. 97% of the population is speaking Portuguese. Whereas you go to Papua New Guinea, there's 800 languages and only 1% of the population speaks anything in common, right? 99% of the time, the person you meet doesn't understand your language. Can you imagine how divisive that would be? So we see that, here are the 7,000 languages, right, where we're at kind of in the early 2000s here. And as we approach a world of 10 billion people, look at the languages just dropping off. Half of them are going to be gone in the next 100 years. We know that dialects are regional variations of a language. How can we hear the regional variation? We hear the accent, especially. But sometimes it's cadence, the pace. Sometimes it's punctuation, right? Sometimes it's rules of grammar, right? Sometimes it's different words that mean the same thing. But especially the accent is where you see the dialect and you hear the dialect as people speak English differently, right? And certainly we know that there's this thing called the isogloss, which is the dividing line between different words that mean the same thing. And in the United States, we have one, for example, soda and pop. What do you call that carbonated beverage? Well, if you're from the deep South, you just call it Coke, and it doesn't really matter what the brand name on the side of the can is. It's just Coke, right? But, in different parts of America, it's either soda or it's pop, depending on where you're coming from. When I was a little kid growing up in Tennessee, if somebody asked you if you wanted a pop, that meant you were about to get hit. So, generally, we didn't use the word pop in the South, right? All right, pop is a Midwestern word, right? You go up to like Chicago and Wisconsin. Hey, you want a pop, Marge? Right? Soda was more of a Southern Western word, right? But Coke was just, more used than anything else. Sometimes dialects are sometimes they're mutually intelligible. You can understand each other, but sometimes you can't, right? You go to different parts of China. Not everybody speaks Mandarin. And sometimes you need help translating. You're like, I'm not real sure what this person's saying because the regional variation is very different. And in China, you'll have say Cantonese and Taiwanese, right? And Shanghainese. And you'll get these different variations of Chinese around the country. Mandarin being the one that the government is promoting and the one that the government is using in the school system, right? And in the media. Here's what we meant by soda and pop and Coke, right? Coke very much in the deep South. Soda up in the Northeast, pop in the Midwest, for sure. But also think about y'all and you guys, Or if you're from Philly, use guys. If you guys have any grandparents or parents from Philadelphia, they might say use. It's the plural of you. You go get your cheesesteaks. Use guys want to go get some steaks, right? And if you're in the deep South, of course, y'all was the big thing. Y'all want to go to the Walmart? It's Friday night. Walmart's a place to go see other people. My parents, my mom grew up in a little town called Lawrenceburg in Tennessee. I remember when Lawrenceburg got the first Walmart. It was the place to meet people on a Friday night. They had a movie theater across the street from the Walmart. It only had 2 screens. You guys go to a movie theater. Well, I mean, in the coronavirus world, it's hard to go to the movies now, but you guys have these premier movie theaters with like 29 different screens. In Lawrenceburg, there were just 2, right? I remember they showed Star Wars on both of them. So when we think about language families, almost half the world speaks an Indo-European language, basically from India to Europe, right? All these languages kind of in between. The next biggest one of these families is Sino-Tibetan. That's Mandarin, that's Chinese, plus all the different kinds of Chinese that go with it, right? And then you see all these other big language families. Austronesian is in Southeast Asia, right? The island chains, the archipelagos. We see Afroasiatic, which is basically from the Sahara down, right? From the Sahara up. I meant to say up. Afroasiatic is going to go through the Middle East, right? This is where Arabic comes from, is from Afroasiatic. Niger Congo is the one that is sub-Saharan Africa, and that's going to be the one where Swahili comes from, a big language that you'll hear throughout Africa. Dravidian is in the southern part of India. The northern part of India is Indo-European, so Hindi is Indo-European, but Tagalog and Tamil are going to be very common in southern India, right? Tamil and Telugu, right? Tagalog is in the Philippines. That's Austronesian. Japanese, kind of a language family all by itself, doesn't really mix with anything else. Altaic is where Turkish comes from. And Altaic actually comes from the Altai Mountains, which are out towards Mongolia. There's some evidence that Japanese and Turkish are somewhat related to each other in terms of their mechanics of the language. And then, of course, you got the other families as well. Now, these aren't languages. These are families of languages. So it's kind of like, we talk about a family tree. I'll show you one in just a second. All of those families I just talked about, plus a few other ones, are here on the map. So you can kind of see where they are. And you can see, how they're represented. Notice that in the Western Hemisphere, you see all Indo-European. That's not true until the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, the French, and everybody comes to America, right? And by America, I mean everything from North America to South America, everything in between. All of the indigenous languages of the Western Hemisphere are generally gone or are going, right? They're all heavily, heavily endangered, except maybe Quechua in South America, which is still widely spoken. So what do we know about these Indo-European languages? The most widely spoken one, we said Indo-European, half the world. We know that there are then groups within these language families. So for example, inside the Indo-European family, you can get Indo-Iranian, which is basically Hindi out towards Persian, right? Or Farsi, as we call the Iranian language of the modern day. The Slavic group, which is Russian especially, but also the other Slavic languages, right? You've got the Romance group. There are 5 in there. Spanish is the one everybody knows, right? Italian, obviously, comes from Latin, right? Portuguese, French. Don't forget the thumb, the one everybody forgets. And I've got a few of you guys in my class this year. You know the answer because it's Romanian. Right? Remember, Romance is Romanian as well. Why is it the thumb versus the other 4? These 4 are much closer together geographically. What does Tobler tell us? Everything's related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things, right? So Romanian is the one that's going to be very different than the other 4. Germanic, that's where English comes from, right? We are a Germanic language, even though we do have a big infusion of Latin because of when the French invaded England in 1066. William the Conqueror brought his Frenchness into the UK. English, of course, is very widely spoken around the world, right? More people speak English as a second language than any other language in the world. But English is not the most widely spoken language as a first, right? Mandarin is the biggest one, right? And that's partly because of population. And then people say, well, then why isn't Hindi bigger? India is much more linguistically divided. Not everybody in India speaks Hindi, right? You've also got Gujarati, you've got Marathi. You have, like I said, the Tamil and the Telugu speakers of the Dravidian family, right? You have all kinds of diversity around the Indian subcontinent. Now, certainly Hindi is widely spoken. It is the language of government. It's the language of a lot of educational systems in India. And usually English is kind of a default as well. Anybody that's highly educated in India is going to have a tremendous command of the English language. We know that Spanish is now rivaling English as a first language in the world. Mostly this is because of fertility, right? Hispanic families tend to have more kids, right? We know that Arabic is also fast growing, and it's a widely spoken language, hundreds of millions of people, right? So if we put these in order, Mandarin number one, English holding on to number two, Spanish, Hindi, Arabic, all right up there in that top 5 area of most widely spoken languages. If we were going to map Indo-European, the Indo-Iranian is kind of there from, like I said, India to Iran. Notice that the southern part of India holds on to that Dravidian. I always tell kids, India, almost think of it like as an ice cream cone. The cone of India is going to be different than the ice cream on top in terms of, language and that kind of identity. But across through Pakistan, where Urdu is very common, and by the way, Urdu and Hindi, the same language, audially, you hear it the same, but written in a different alphabet. And then you go across through Afghanistan, you hear a lot of Pashtun and Farsi as you get into Iran. And then you got the Slavic, the Russian, right? And also into Ukraine and Poland and the Baltic states, right? Bulgaria, Serbia, all Slavic there, Serbo-Croatian. Then you've got the Romance. Notice that Romania is there by itself. And then, of course, you've got the Germanic group as well, which is where English comes from. There's also a couple of small ones in there. You got the Celtic languages in Ireland and Scotland and Wales. You've got an interesting one there in the mountains of France and Spain. You have Euskera, right? It's the Basque language, the language of the Basque people. We're not even really sure where it comes from. It's so old, it's kind of there by itself. And they're vigorously independence-minded in the Basque country of France and Spain. They want to be their own independent ethno-nationalistic state. All right. Oh, and by the way, and you notice there are some parts of Europe that are not really colored in there. Hungarian is not an Indo-European language, right? Finnish is not an Indo-European language. Turkish is not an Indo-European. Remember, Turkish is Altaic, right? Finland is Uralic, right? Again, the Hungarian language, Magyar, it's not really kind of related to anything else. It's just kind of a pocket by itself. So what do we know about the native speakers? I already kind of told you a little bit about this. Here's your big languages in the world. By the way, all of these are the killers. These are the ones that are wiping out the lesser used indigenous minority languages. European languages, of course, we know a lot of these. I'll give you a second to read this slide. I've got a map that kind of correlates with it. We know that European languages and borders really correlate a lot. Every time you cross a border in Europe, you generally cross a language barrier as well. India is like that too. But you got to change scale of analysis. Instead of going country to country to country, you're going from one state in India to another state. India has states like we do, like Mexico does, like Brazil does, right? Like Nigeria does. And when you cross state boundaries in India and you go from, say, Uttar Pradesh, right, and you go to a different state in India, right, you're going to hear that the language will change. Right. And different parts of India will have a different identity in that sense. And that's why the political framework of India is somewhat less stable than, say, a country like China, where it's an authoritarian, unitary system of government. Right. The government says, no, everybody's going to speak Mandarin. Right. So when you take a look at this slide, read through it, and you'll see what I mean by this high correlation to the map that you're about to see. Take a second. Okay, so when you look at the map, right, and you see what I wrote about on the previous slide, you can see again the Slavic is orange, the Germanic is the green, the Romance is, kind of that, I don't know, French vanilla color, for lack of a better description from a colorblind teacher. And then notice that Finnish and Hungarian and Turkish are different. Greek is kind of in a group by itself. There's nothing like Greek in Europe. Right? Albanian is kind of by itself in the sense that there's nothing close. And then again, don't forget about your Basques. Don't forget about your Welsh and Irish and Scottish. There's another one interesting there, one called Catalan. And that's a big part of Barcelona's independence identity. Right? Catalan is a language that is very, very similar to Spanish. Don't go to Barcelona and suggest that they're speaking Spanish. They will shank you. I mean, they're fiercely independence minded, and their language is part of that identity. Right? The Barcelona soccer team wears the colors of the Catalan identity, the red and the blue, the blaugrana. Right? And that is their kind of their identity. When we went to Barcelona on our spring break trip a couple of years ago, there were a lot of independence movements, going on at that time. And you would see signs on people's apartments and flags hanging, and they would have signs that would say Independencia es el futuro, right? Not el futuro, right? Not Spanish. Independencia es el futuro, right? So Catalan, slightly different, right? The Spanish people will sometimes tell you, it's just a dialect of Spanish. The Catalan people, no, it's not, right? It's our own language. Don't you forget it. It's what makes us, deserve our own country, okay? So languages in South Asia, I already talked a little bit about India being linguistically divided. Again, you can read through this slide, you can pause, you can take a second to read through it in the interest of, not keeping you up past your bedtime. And I know you probably got math homework and things like that as well. You can certainly stop and you can read through this, right? But again, India particularly linguistically fragmented. Even Pakistan is linguistically fragmented, but there's 3 really big languages in Pakistan. Urdu is the biggest one. Bangladesh, pretty much monolingual. Bengali is the one big language in Bangladesh, but Bengali can be spoken in India too. You'll actually hear Bengali speakers across the border. Right. So when we see, India as, one country, one federal state, you got to remember that within it, they have states like we do, and you're going to see that there's a lot of linguistic division. And there's a map that kind of shows you what I mean when you see the slide previously. All right, in Africa, the same thing. Tremendous linguistic division. A couple of really big families, particularly Niger-Congo in sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, where you hear a lot of Arabic being spoken in the Islamic states, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, all of those places where big Arabic speakers are going to be found, big numbers of Arabic speakers. And we know Arabic is one of those killers that we talked about, but ironically, Swahili is a killer too, because so many people in sub-Saharan Africa have started picking up Swahili as a common language that they're losing their own smaller indigenous tribal identity languages. And here's a great map that shows you how linguistically divided sub-Saharan Africa is. Okay. So again, look at the legend. You see a lot of the different families. Remember, there's also Indo-European languages in Africa too. Those would have been brought in by the European colonizers during the imperial era. The English, the French, and the Portuguese, right? And the Dutch and the German, all of these people that kind of came into Africa and brought their colonial languages. You'll still hear those colonial languages today. But generally speaking, the people are going to use their own indigenous tribal languages in family communication and in community cultures. But as soon as they're in the big city or in business or in some kind of government role, oftentimes you'll hear the colonial language will come out. It's a legacy of colonization. When we say Chinese, are we talking about one language, or are we actually talking about a bunch of different languages? Most people consider them dialects, but they're not always mutually intelligible, right? When we went to China in 2006, our guide was from Beijing. He spoke Mandarin, and everywhere we went, when we went to Hong Kong, when we went to Shanghai, and when we went to Xi'an, he needed a translator to help him, right? Especially as you go out towards Shanjing, where the Uyghur population lives. And again, they don't speak a Mandarin language, but the government today is forcing them to give up some of their identity. And this is a big kind of like, public outcry going on right now about the plight of the Uyghur people in the face of the Chinese authorities and the state governments out there, right? So even if Mandarin alone were just, one language rather than all of the Chinese languages, Mandarin would still be almost 1 billion speakers, right? The Han Chinese ethnicity. And this, again, gives you a great identity of, Southern China tends to be more linguistically, and guys, this is a Toblerism again. Beijing is far in the northern part of China, right? The farther away you get from the government control, the more linguistic diversity you're going to find, right? Everything's related to everything else. Near things are more related than distant things. Right. So let's talk about this language family tree. Like we do with animals, like we do with chemistry, with biology, with any of these kinds of things, we group things together based on similarities, right? So when we think about languages, we know that dialects are close because it's a regional variation of a language, but then over time and over distance, right, they diverge, they grow apart. But we also know that in the world today, sometimes languages converge, they come together and they blend. So we have to be prepared for both of these things, right? So this is what we mean by the language family tree. And you see that these go back under the line, which means before writing. And this is why we can't really figure all this stuff out for sure. Because, how do we know what the first language was? That could have gone back hundreds of millions of years ago, right? We only have written history for maybe the last 10,000 years or so. So it's very hard for us to figure out where these languages have come from. What we do know is how diverse and spread out, of course, they are. Indo-European being the biggest branch, right, of the tree. Now, when we think about in the United States, we have our own linguistic divisions, right? Because we do have a very large ethnic minority of different language speakers, particularly those that are Hispanic in the United States. Now, Hispanics are not yet a big enough group for a national impact. It's much more felt at the regional level. California, Texas, Florida, New York, right? As you zoom in and change your scale of analysis, the impact of Latinos is going to be more felt, right? So if you think about California, 40% of California speak Spanish as a first language, right? In Florida, that number is usually about 1 out of 4. Okay. So it's not like we're going to say, Spanish should be equal to the, use of English. In some states, they are officially bilingual. New Mexico, for example, is officially bilingual, right? But the United States doesn't even have an official language. Honestly, we don't, right? English is just the standard language. It's the one we use in school. It's the one the government uses. It's the one that's mostly used in the media and in business. And so therefore, it's not an official language. It's a standard language, right? Lots of countries have an official language that is set by law. The United States does not have an official language. Okay. Language and culture. Obviously, we talked about language being a big part of your identity, right? We know that some countries in the world are, bilingual, multilingual, right? Some are monolingual, but you look at places like Canada, where Quebecois French has a really strong regional presence in the province of of Quebec. We know that in Belgium, it's linguistically divided between Flemings and Walloons. I've already talked to you about, India and Nigeria being so divided. South Africa also has a lot of different languages, right, that are being spoken. And again, any country in the world, language is going to have some political overtones, right? We know that. So when we think about multilingualism, these are the countries where more than one language is going to be used on a daily basis and where citizens are almost always capable of speaking more than one language. Okay. And you see this, for example, in Belgium very, very commonly. Okay. You see it a lot in other countries of the world, not so much in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, you see a lot of people that are multilingual. Okay. But again, whenever you see ethno-nationalistic, linguistic, religious, cultural differences, if we combine that with the fact that, hey, you're on land that I think should belong to me, that's where you get conflict, right? Whenever you're fighting about land, that's when the conflict gets real. We can say that it's about religion. We can say it's about language. We can say it's about ethnic identity. The reality is the conflict is going to be about the land, right? That's what we're fighting about. We know that in the history of the Soviet Union, the Russians tried to wipe out anybody else's identity. They wanted everybody to speak Russian. They wanted everybody to be Russian because they wanted you to be completely devoted to the state, right? And their program, Russification, meant that you had to give up your Kazakh identity. You had to give up your Ukrainian identity. You had to give up your Estonian identity, right? You had to become Russian, right? So we talked about Belgium being linguistically divided, Flemings and Walloons. You can look this up. We'll talk a little bit about this, of course, in class as well. You can certainly, in the David Palmer Blue Book, there's a lot of great examples of countries that are kind of linguistically divided like this, right? Belgium is a great one. I mentioned France. When you hear French in Canada, you know that you're in Quebec. As soon as you get outside of Quebec, you don't hear French as much, right? This is a formal region. If you guys remember all those different kinds of regions that we learned about in Unit 1, something like 80% or more of Quebec will speak French. But it's interesting because when we went to France a few years ago, we had a girl on our trip who was Quebecois French. And when we were in Paris, every time she would try to talk, she would say, "Mr. Turner, these people in Paris, they don't like the way I speak French," because her Quebecois French was very different than the French that's spoken in France. We talked about Nigeria, these different parts of Nigeria. I have a very good friend at the AP Reading. Her name is Ibipo Johnson Anamewu. And she got married in the United States to a Nigerian man. They both had come to America to go to college in New York. And she told me one time, and I remember, just as you get to know people and we got to be friendly, and I asked her about being Nigerian, and she told me that her husband was from a different tribe. She's Igbo and he's Yoruba. And I was like, Abipo. I was like, what happened? Were your parents okay with that? And she's like, well, my parents were in Nigeria. His parents were in Nigeria. We got married in the States, whatever. And I knew she had 3 kids. And I said, what about your kids? Did they grow up speaking Igbo or did they grow up speaking Yoruba? And she's like, Kevin, they speak English. They're Americans. And she just thought that was so funny that I would ask about Yoruba or Igbo, right? And fun story, years later, I had a girl that went to Yale. And she got into an Uber and, her cab driver, I guess they were talking. He made the comment that he was Nigerian. And she asked him, she said, "Oh, do you speak Hausa or Yoruba or Igbo?" And he almost crashed the car because he couldn't figure out how this little white girl from Boca Raton knew anything about Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo speakers in Nigeria. It's pretty cool what you learn in human geography. Okay, language and trade. We know that because of trade, we can sometimes have what we call a lingua franca. This is not French. The lingua franca is the trade language that's used for communication, very simple communication. It's a language that 2 people have in common that is not their own language. Almost always in the modern world today, this is going to be English. Airline pilots, for example, if it's an international flight and the pilots are talking to the people on the ground in the tower and the control center and everything, that's always in English. It doesn't matter what their languages normally are. They're all communicating in English for the simplicity and for the accuracy of making sure that everybody understands what's happening. They all use English, right? We know that historically there was an experiment in Europe to come up with this language called Esperanto. It flopped. It was just another Indo-European language that people didn't see the value in learning. So in Africa today, we can see other lingua franca other than English. Swahili is a good example of a lingua franca, right? Where people across East Africa have bought into this kind of Swahili language as a kind of a Band-Aid. It kind of holds everything together in that part of the world, even though people may speak different languages on a more localized level. Again, change the scale of analysis. We know that creolization is when languages converge, right? Normally, languages are diverging, time, distance, decay. But this is an example of convergence where languages come together. When the French brought slaves into what is today Haiti, the French masters and the Haitian and the African slaves in Haiti had to be able to communicate. So they developed a lingua franca, right? And as that lingua franca developed over time, more words were added to it. The chopped down, simplified language is called a pidgin, not a bird, right? It's a pidgin, P-I-D-G-I-N. Over time, there's a process called creolization, where the language will add new words and more words will need to be, added to as the modernization and technology. And so today, the most famous of these creolized languages is known as Haitian Creole, right? It literally has its name, Haitian Creole. And if you read Haitian Creole, you'll actually see a lot of English words have kind of been jammed into Haitian Creole, especially in recent decades as well. There's a lot of creolized languages in the Caribbean. There's one in Jamaica called Patois. There's one in Curacao that's known as Papamintu. There's one in Papua New Guinea. Remember, I told you that almost nobody speaks the same language. So they've come up with their own creolized pidgin language, and it's called Tok Pisin, right? And basically, it's the word talk pigeon that's been kind of like, talk pisin, right? And this is a good example. There's a sign here, and I'll give you a second to read, and then I'll tell you what it says. Okay, so what this sign says is a road construction project. It says, work along the road. All cars must stop. You're supposed to look for the man with the red sign. Everywhere in the world you go, that stop sign's usually going to be red. And very commonly in the world, that sign's still going to say STOP, regardless of what language in the world is being used. STOP with a red sign is pretty universal, right? All cars must stop, right? When you go to think about official languages, right? Again, we don't have an official language in the United States, but some countries do, right? Many countries are now under pressure. They're saying, well, we don't want this old white colonizer language. We want something that's more indigenous, more ethno-nationalistic. So what's happening a lot in Africa, Asia, Latin America, other places, is that they're changing names that used to be Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, something that was European, and they're making it more authentic. This is like Bombay, India becoming Mumbai, right? It's like, Swaziland becoming Eswatini. They're changing names, right, to make it more indigenous and authentic. So we think about toponyms, and that's a good example. Here's an example in Barcelona. Remember, I told you about Catalan speakers. And what you see on these three signs is that Spanish and Catalan is both on the sign. Now, what's interesting is that Catalan is on top and Spanish is underneath it. And this is Barcelona's way, or Catalunia's way. It's the region of Spain that's known as Catalunya. It's their way of saying our language is more important. Whichever language is on top is going to be the important one. Now, again, as an American, you look at this and you say, I'm not so sure that these are very different. But again, the Catalan people will tell you this is part of our passion. This is part of our identity. This is part of our ethno-nationalistic, identity. If you don't believe me, go to a Barcelona soccer game and you'll see that the fans hang these big banners. Catalonia is not Spain. Well, notice it's in English. Well, who's that message for? That message is not for Catalan people. That message is not even for Spanish people. That message is, hey, we know Messi's popular. We know this game's going to be on TV. We know a lot of Americans are going to watch it. Let's have a big sign in English that says, hey, Catalonia is not Spain. We want you to sympathize with our independence movement, right? When you go to the Camp Nou, their big stadium, and it holds almost 100,000 people, all right, they will sometimes bring out the big Catalan flag. And this is not Photoshop. This is legit. They will hang this big Catalan banner. This is the identity of being Catalan, right? They won't sing the Spanish national anthem. When the Spanish national anthem plays, they'll whistle louder than the music. At like 17 minutes and 18 seconds of each game, they cheer loudly because 1718 was the last year that Catalonia was independent of the Spanish crown. It's so cool, this idea of identity, right? So place names have a big part of that. Now, certainly tourism is part of this, right? Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, changed its name to Zimbabwe. We know that Upper Volta changed their name to Burkina Faso. We know that just recently, Ivory Coast wanted to make their name more French sounding, so they're now officially Côte d'Ivoire. We know that sometimes dictators like to change names of things. We know that sometimes countries fight over territory. The islands off the coast of Argentina, in English, they're known as the Falkland Islands. But if you call them the Falkland Islands in Argentina, you'll get punched in the mouth, right? Because they're Las islas son nuestras. Those islands are ours, right? And they'll say, no, they're the Malvinas, right? They're the Spanish name. We know that sometimes names can be manufactured and made up, right? Google, Kansas, right? The city of I think it was Topeka, Kansas, took a deal from Google that if they allowed their name to change for 1 year, everybody would get free high-speed internet. So they changed their name to Google, Kansas. There's a city in Montana that they wanted to be famous, so they named themselves Joe, Montana. If you're a football fan, especially a 49ers fan, you might know why that's funny. But a city called Joe, comma, Montana. Obviously, place names in a local sense, right? Dr. King Boulevards, those are always going to be representative of Black American identity, right? Because you don't see too many Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevards that run through white suburban neighborhoods. You always see a Dr. King reference in a inner city, urbanized Black community, right? Because again, it's all about that civil rights movement. It's all about identifying with that cause. We see a lot of Confederate names being ripped down. We see statues being taken down. We see name changes of schools and parks and city buildings, right? And street names especially that are being removed, right? Because, right, these identities are constantly being fought over. Again, there is a classification of toponyms. I'm not going to spend too much of a time here talking about this because I know you can read it and then you can look at the map that I'm going to show you and you can see some examples, 2, 4, 6, 8, there they are. There's 10 of them there, right? And you can see these as you go forward. Let me give you a second to read. Okay, now you look at this map. Saint names in Quebec, right? In French Canada, very Catholic. Saint names in Louisiana, French Catholics. Saint names in Texas and in California. I mentioned these earlier in the slideshow. Very Hispanic, Spanish Catholics, right? Where you see Protestants, you don't see these saint names. Right? They don't appear on the landscape. Or if they do, they're very, very, very less likely to be seen. When we went to Wales a few years ago on our spring break trip, we actually went to this place. They call it LV, Llanfair. And basically, this is the longest place name in the world. Other places have now challenged it and they've made up their own names as well. But if you see in English underneath, you see what it means. But this has now become an unofficial test of your Welshness. If you can pronounce this, you're Welsh. If you can't pronounce it, you're not Welsh, right? And I butcher it every time. Llanfair pu gwingle gogerich, Sandrobel, Santicilio gogogosh, right? That's kind of not really how the Welsh people say it. But if you look carefully in this picture, right, there's a kid. If you see Mr. Turner with the Arsenal hat on over in the court, yeah, go figure. He was wearing a cannon on his head. If you look about 2 kids over to my right, your left, you can see a kid in the back there, right? One of my students from Spanish River who actually could say this place name really well. And it was like bizarre because we would kind of put him up to it in front of Welsh people and go, hey, Hayden can say it. And then we would get him to say it. It was like party tricks. We were like, Hayden, say it, say it. And he would say it. And the Welsh people would be like, oh, this kid's really Welsh, right? But he's not. He's from Boca. Remember I told you about the islands, right? Argentina's soccer team a couple of years ago got in trouble because FIFA says you're not supposed to make political statements during soccer games. Well, they had this big banner, Las Malvinas son Argentinas. You know, Argentina and Great Britain fought a war over these islands. There's more penguins there than people, right? But they fought a war over the Malvinas in 1982. And so the Argentinian soccer team got in trouble, right? Because they were making this big political statement about the ownership of the islands. By the way, they're still British. The Argentinians lost that war. Now, the former Argentinian president, Christina Kirchner, had a big meeting recently with the Pope. I don't know if you guys know, Pope Francis is Argentinian by birth, right? And so they met each other and I don't know, the devil wears Prada. I mean, she deliberately dressed all in black for this occasion. And here's the Pope. I don't know if you can read the whole facial expression there. They don't exactly like each other a whole lot, right? He was very liberal. She's very conservative. And so when she met him after he became Pope, this was an official visit. She was the president of Argentina, and he was the Pope, right? And they're shaking hands, and supposedly the transcript was that she told him, now that you're the Pope, you have to help us get the Malvinas back. That was her big mission. You've got to help us get the Malvinas. You're the Pope. And he responded to her, Madam, I'm not interested in political affairs on this earth. I'm only interested in things that happen in heaven, right? And so he basically told her, yeah, I'm not going to help you, right? So when we think about religion, we know that this is also a big part of our identity. We think that this is, like language, it's part of who we are, right? It's a foundation of our culture. We know that every religion in the world has expectations, right? Whether it's the 10 commandments of the Jewish world that the Christians adopted, whether it's Sharia law, right? The law of the Quran, the law of the Prophet Muhammad that he gave to the Islamic world, whether it's Buddha's eightfold path, the Four Noble Truths, right? We know that all faiths are going to have expectations, right? Things that you should do, things that you should not do, right? We know that religions are always changing because of modernization. We know that religious leaders usually try to slow down that modernization and change. They like to keep it traditional. They like to keep it original, right? But people oftentimes change the faith over time. We know that religion affects everything about who we are, whether we're religious or not, right? It's affected in things like Chick-fil-A not being open on Sundays, right? You may not be very Christian at all, but you're not going to get a Chick-fil-A sandwich on Sunday because the founders of the company are very religious and they choose not to open think about how much money they give up by not being open on Sunday, right? You think about Sharia law that I just mentioned. Now, clearly, closer to Mecca, it's going to be more Sharia law, right? It's going to be more conservative, more fundamental, more, Muslim. It's going to be more authentic. Toblerism, right? The farther away you get, generally, it's going to be less likely to be super religious and super strict, right? Although there are exceptions. Malaysia has Sharia law in some cases. So does Nigeria in some cases. So we know that religion has different source areas. Remember, we call them hearth areas. We know that the two Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, come pretty much from the same place. Buddha was born as a Hindu prince, right? Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha. He became enlightened. We know that the Western religions, they start, remember, with the people of the book, right? The Jews were the first of the monotheistic faiths, right? We know that the Islamic world comes out of Abraham. But remember that in the Islamic world, he becomes Ibrahim, right? And remember that Abraham and his wife couldn't have kids. So God allowed him to have a child with Hagar. And this is where we get Ishmael, which is where the Muslim world comes from. And then the Jewish world comes from Abraham and Sarah when they're finally able to have a child of their own, right? This is why when you think about the Hebrew and the Arabic languages, I don't know how much you guys know about linguistics, but they're both Afro-Asiatic and they're from the same group and they're very similar, Hebrew and Arabic, right? When you hear the word shalom and the word salam, right? Salam is Islamic for peace and shalom is the Hebrew word for peace. Shalom and salam are the same word, right? And they sound very similar. So when we think about the world religiously, we know that after the Jews, the Muslims came out one way and the Christians came out the other way. Remember, Jesus and all of his followers were Jewish, right? Before this idea of Christianity started. So we see that everywhere in the world, again, there's a lot of similarities. We tend to think of the differences, but there's a lot of similarities. And then of course, there's secularism, the people that aren't very religious at all. It doesn't mean that they're atheist. It doesn't mean that they deny religion. It just means that, as my former student told me, it's one of the funniest things I had ever heard. He said, Mr. Turner, my family, we're not Jewish. We're Jewish, a little bit, right? Because that's kind of what's happened. People go to church 2 days a year, Christmas and Easter. The other 50 weeks out of the year, the parking lot is empty, right? And it's happening in most faiths. It's happening in the Islamic world. It's happening in the Buddhist world. It's happening in the Hindu world. It's happening in every religious world. Take a look at the map. You can certainly see the distribution and the density of different parts of the world in terms of religion, who's the majority. But look at the circle graphs, the pie charts, you'll see that there's diversity, right? When you change scale, right? When you look at this as a global map, but as a regional scale of analysis, because regional scale, everything here is a region. If you zoom in to that region and look country by country by country, right? If you zoom into the country and you look within the country at a local level, you'll see the other religions, right? That don't show up on a choropleth map. Because remember, choropleth is going to show you the biggest one. So we know that there's two kinds of religions, universalizing and ethnic. We know that the universalizing religions, they're the ones that want to spread. They want you to believe what they believe. They want everybody to follow their faith, right? So they'll come knock on your door and they'll say, hey, can we tell you about our religion? Right? And then there's the ethnic ones, the ones that are like, we don't really care if you believe what we believe. You're kind of born into that religion. And Hinduism is very much like that. You cannot become Hindu. You're born into the Hindu faith, right? And to a certain degree, the Jewish world is like that, right? You're Jewish if your mother's Jewish, right? It's an ethnic faith. It's not universalizing. They're not looking to convert anybody. They're, it's not like when you drive down the street and you see like a Christian church and there's a sign outside that says, hey, 10:30 on Sunday, we'd love to see you come over, right? And they're always trying to get somebody to come in, and they're always trying to get somebody to believe what they believe. The Islamic world is like that. The Buddhist world is like that. They're universalizing, right? And so the diffusion will be different. The diffusion of a universalizing religion is contagious. It's going to expand. Whereas an ethnic religion is going to be relocation. You can find Hindu people outside of India, not because somebody in Texas said, hey, maybe we should be Hindu too. No, because people from India moved and brought their Hindu faith with them. And then they decided, let's build a Hindu temple in Houston. And then other Hindu people moved there too. And they said, hey, look at this. We got a Hindu temple. All right, good for us. Right? But there's no increase, right? It's the same number. They just moved from one place to another. It's relocation diffusion. We know that there's a diaspora, right? Where people are related by their faith, but they live geographically separated from each other. In the case of the Jews, this is a really big issue, both before and after the Holocaust, right? Remember that the Jewish population of the world was cut in half during the Holocaust. And it's sad because, they have statistics now, like 1 out of every 10 American kids will now tell you, I've never even heard of the Holocaust. What are we doing in school? I know we teach it, right? But when you think about the history of the Jewish people, it's a history of persecution. Every small religion in the world has been persecuted by bigger religions, right? And by the way, Judaism is considered major if you consider the impact. If you consider numbers of believers, you'll sometimes they'll say, well, there's 4 major religions. If they say 4, they're saying Christianity, right, is the biggest one. Islam is the second, and it's the fastest growing. And then you've got Buddhism, and then you have Hinduism, because Judaism is small. And kids will say it's small because of the Holocaust. No, it's not. It's small because it was always small. It was always ethnic. They weren't looking to get bigger, right? Now, then kids will say, well, Hinduism is ethnic too. Why is it so big? Well, don't forget, India has over 1 billion people, right? We know that population was super explosively growing even in the ancient world, right? The Jewish population just never grew. It was never big to begin with, right? So when we think about the distribution and the density, geography plays a role in all of these things, okay? So look at this pie chart. It shows you the different faiths. It shows you which ones are universalizing, which ones are ethnic. It shows you a little bit, obviously the names. The numbers represent the percentage of the world, right, that fits into that faith, right, that pie-shaped sector, right? So if you think about Christianity, right, where you see, okay, there's the 3% that are Orthodox, the 7% that are Protestant, the 17% that are Catholic. Remember, all Catholics are Christians, but not all Christians are Catholics, right? Kids don't understand this, right? So you've got what, 25-30% of the world Christian? Then you have 2 different kinds of Muslims. You've got the Sunni Muslims and the Shiite Muslims, right? And the Sunni is by far the bigger group. The Shia group is much smaller, okay? Even within Buddhism, you have different sects. You have different divisions, right? Hinduism is a big portion because, again, the population of India is very big. The East Asian religions, technically not really religions because there's no deity, but this would be like Confucianism, Taoism, all right, or Taoism. And then remember, there's 14% of the world that's just not religious at all. And that number is growing, right? People are becoming less religious all the time. Generally speaking, the wealthier you become, the less religious you become, right? It's the poorest parts of the world that are the most faithful. After all, don't they have to have faith, right? They certainly don't have anything else, right? They better hope, oh, God will help me, right? Because, they don't have their own life that they can fall back on. They're dependent on their faith, right? Not so much in the developed countries. This is showing you all the different kinds of Christians we have in the United States. By far, it is the biggest religion in the United States. But remember, our government has a system where separation of church and state. That doesn't mean that there's no religion. It means there's no one church that the United States government supports or encourages, right? And certainly, if you look at the lower right-hand corner, it's not just the Christians of the United States, it's actually the other religions as well. And I think those numbers will surprise you how small those numbers get, right? The Muslim, the Jewish, the Buddhist, the Hindu, right? The others, okay? This is a cool map that shows you the biggest Christian denominations. Look at the Deep South, the Bible Belt, as they call it, with the Baptist Church. Look at the Lutherans in the Midwest, a lot of Swedish and German people moving into Minnesota in the 1800s for cheap farmland. You look at the Latter-day Saints Church, the LDS, what used to be known as more the Mormon Church, out in Utah, because they moved out there so that nobody could pick on them because they were different, right? You can see up in the northeastern parts of the United States, there's a very large Catholic population, mostly because of Irish and Italian immigrants. Whereas along the border with Mexico, you see Texas, California, a large Catholic population because of the Latino migration in from Mexico, Central America, and Latin America. Same thing with South Florida a little bit as well. Again, to see smaller religions, you'd have to change your scale of analysis. If you zoomed into Palm Beach County, then you could see, oh, there's a Jewish presence on this landscape, right? But if you zoom out to this national view, because the number is so small, it's not going to show up on this choropleth map. But what are some of these other religions? Again, I'll let you read through this part. But basically, Shintoism in Japan. We mentioned Confucianism and Taoism in China. The Chinese government is officially atheist. Therefore, all kinds of religions are persecuted, especially Christianity. Buddhism is generally tolerated because there is no deity in Buddhism. The Buddha is not like Jesus in that sense. He's not a savior. He's not a divine being. You know, he is a teacher, right? And in Theravada Buddhism, he's really just a teacher. In Mahayana, he takes on the form of a divine being. And certainly it's that small vessel versus large vessel mentality of Buddhism. The small vessel idea of Theravada is that every person goes to nirvana by themselves, right? You achieve your own enlightenment, you hit your own nirvana, you go. In Mahayana, everybody goes, it's the large vessel. Everybody goes to nirvana together. The Buddha kind of takes everybody and helps everybody. And you know, they all go to nirvana at the same time. Right? So depends on where you are in the Buddhist world, kind of how Buddha is interpreted in terms of divinity or in terms of, you know, supernatural being. Okay. When you think about shamanism and animism, these are different beliefs that are mostly in indigenous parts of the world. You can see this, for example, in Native Americans. You can see it in tribal parts of Africa. You know, anywhere in the world, the indigenous people of Australia and New Zealand, the Aboriginal people, the Maori people, where they have the beliefs of the physical spirits, but also the beliefs of the interactions with animals, right? And certainly in Australia, we saw that when we went to Australia. We went to an Aboriginal village, and they taught us a lot about their beliefs of the animals and the physical world. So always interesting to read through this. Right? Other minority faiths in the world, again, very small numbers of believers, and you could certainly look some of these up. Baha'i in the Middle East, the Druze, which is a very, very conservative version of Islam that you can find in the Middle East, Jainism in southern India, Sikhism in northwestern India, particularly in a state that's known as the Punjab state. And that's where the Sikh community is mostly focused around the Golden Temple there in Amritsar. A beautiful, beautiful building, very world famous. Sikhs are always recognizable because of their turban that they wear on their head. And actually, it's something that is very interesting. I used to have a student, Adiraj, who told me the story, and he said, it's so that we are recognizable. It's so that if there's something wrong in the world and somebody sees a person of my faith, they know that we have to help, right? And he's saying, by wearing the headdress, you can't hide. You can't blend in. You can't be different. You can't be the same as everybody else. You're going to stick out, and you're going to have to be accountable to your religion and to your faith and to your culture. And it's just a very interesting way to look at it, right? But this is what we sometimes mean as syncretism, because Sikhism is kind of a blend. It has reincarnation, but it's also monotheistic. So it's very much like a mixture almost of Islam and Hinduism, but in a unique new way that is known as Sikhism. Remember secularism, when people are not very religious, right? Um, we have billions of people who will identify as being a certain religion, but will they be religious? Okay. Sometimes freedom of religion becomes freedom from religion, as you see at the bottom there. Okay. So we don't mean necessarily atheist, although there are millions of atheists in the world. When we say secular and when we say, not religious, that doesn't mean that they're denying faith. It just means that they're not really practicing it, especially in the modern world. You'll find people that don't generally follow the rules, right? Muslims aren't supposed to smoke. They're not supposed to drink alcohol, right? Jewish people aren't supposed to eat pork products, right? They're not supposed to get tattoos, right? There's certain prohibitions in any religion, right? And what's happening is that sometimes people are just kind of not really following all the rules, right? For a long time, the Catholic Church has always taught that abortion was a mortal sin. Today, there was a recent survey, 56% of American Catholics take a moderate view of abortion. They're not really all that opposed to it anymore, right? Again, it's a weakening of the religiosity, right? The strength of the faith, right? It's becoming more secularized. So just like language, religion can either bring people together or it can divide them apart. We've got conflicts all over the world, interfaith between different religions, intra-faith within a religion, different sects, different denominations fighting against each other. Remember, I've said this several times in the slideshow, it's land that people are fighting about, right? It's not really about language. It's not about religion. It's not about identity. It's not about race. It's not about ethnicity. It's about territory. That's what they're fighting about, okay? Remember, fundamentalism is when you have people who are really faithful. And sometimes fundamentalism becomes extremism and it becomes intolerant, where people say, I hate you because you don't believe what I believe, right? And extremism can get to the point of terrorism, right? So they asked a question years ago about, do you believe in God? And if you look at the United States, it was about 2 out of 3. But if you look at the Philippines, it was like 90%. If you look at Chile, 70%. Even in Israel, it was only 2 out of 3, right? In the Czech Republic, East Germany, it was barely 20%, not even 20%, and less than 10%. Communist countries tend to be atheist, right? So I'm not going to believe in God in East Germany, the former communist Czech Republic. Even in Israel and the United States, you would think that Israel would be very religious. A lot of people in Israel today are not as religious as they used to be. A lot of Americans not as religious as they used to be, certainly even just 2 generations ago, right? But you look at the poorer countries where people are more faithful and more religious and practice their faith more, right? And you can see that all around the world. Richer countries tend to be less religious. Poorer countries tend to be more religious, right? Okay, I know I've hit you with a lot. It's a huge unit, right? Unit 3, a lot of cultural geography. We're going to have a lot of fun talking about a lot of different places in the world, their way of life, their food, their dress, their music, their sports, their holidays, their customs, their traits, their taboos, right? And as we go through these topics, right, you can always come back and forth to the slideshow. Don't forget you got videos out there on AP Daily that you can check out by topic, right? My friend Mr. Hill and my friend Miss Patel will be dealing with Unit 3, right? They'll be taking turns with those AP Daily topics. And certainly we'll be going through topic questions in class. And we've got some more really cool things that we can do in terms of those ESRI geo inquiries as well, right? Until then, be healthy, right? Help your parents, as I say every day in class, right? And I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks for watching, right? That's it, Unit 3.